The sergeant sat behind a desk with a list of names written out on a sheet of coarse paper, the handwriting small and precise, each letter formed with the care of a man who had performed this task 1,000 times. He was a man of middle years with a face that held no expression beyond patient endurance, his red coat unbuttoned at the collar and his own musket leaning against the wall behind him. The candle on his desk burned with a tall, still flame, and the wax had pooled and hardened around the base in overlapping rings of cream and amber. He looked at you and then back at the paper, running a calloused finger down the column of names until it stopped at your surname. His lips moved slightly as he read, a silent mouthing of the letters, and then he spoke in a low voice that did not carry beyond the desk. "Midnight to 4, he said. "Northwest Bastion. Draw your musket and cartridges from the rack, take a lantern from the quartermaster on your way out, and report to the post at 11:45 for inspection." You acknowledged the order with a nod, and he pushed the ledger toward you, turning it so that you could read the lines already filled in by the men on the earlier watches. The page was divided into neat columns for the date, the man's name, his company, the hours of his duty, and the signature that confirmed he understood his orders. You picked up the quill pen from the inkwell, tapping the excess ink gently against the rim, and bent over the page to write your surname and the letter of your company. The nib scratched across the paper in a slow, deliberate stroke, leaving behind a line of dark ink that gleamed wet for a moment before sinking into the fibers. The sound was a soft, rhythmic scritch-scritch that seemed very loud in the small, quiet room, and when you finished, you laid the pen down with care and watched the sergeant blot the signature with a square of worn felt. The instructions were simple, the same ones you had heard every time you drew night duty, and the sergeant recited them in the same flat tone he always used, a voice with no rise and fall, as though he were reading the words from the wall. "Keep your eyes on the tree line," he said, and you knew he meant the dark line of forest that ran along the ridge to the north, the place where the trunks of pine and birch stood close together like a palisade of their own making. Challenge anyone who approaches the post, giving them a single verbal warning and then firing only if they fail to answer with the countersign. Call out the half hour and the all's well so that the guardhouse and the other sentries can mark the time and know that the fort is secure. Do not leave your station until properly relieved by the corporal of the guard, and do not sit down or lean against the palisade while you are on post. That was the sum of it, a list of duties repeated so often that they had become a part of the night itself, as natural as the ticking of the clock. You left the orderly room and walked down a narrow passageway lit by a single lantern hanging from a beam, passing the racks of muskets that stood in orderly rows like soldiers at attention. Each weapon rested in its own slot, the barrels blued and oiled, the flints sitting snug in the jaws of the lock, and you selected one from the third rack on the left, the number matching the chit the sergeant had given you. The musket was heavier than it looked, the weight of the walnut stock and iron barrel settling into your hands with a familiar grounding heft, and you slung the cartridge box over your shoulder, feeling the leather strap settle across your chest and the wooden block inside press against your hip. The cartridges were arranged in neat holes drilled into the block, each one a paper tube containing a ball and a measure of black powder, and you checked the count by touch, your fingers finding the paper ends, all of them dry and intact. The quartermaster's hatch was a small window cut into the wall of the store's building, and when you approached, a hand appeared from the darkness inside and passed you a lantern made of tin and horn. The candle inside was new, a full column of beeswax with a fresh wick, and you lifted the glass pane to light it from the taper burning on the shelf, the flame catching with a small puff of smoke that smelled faintly of honey. The horn panels glowed a warm amber, casting a circle of light about 3 paces wide, and you closed the little door and made sure the ring at the top was secure for hanging. The quartermaster, a man who rarely spoke, said only, "Good watch," in a voice that was more a grunt than words, and then his hand withdrew and the hatch went dark again. You stepped out into the night. The parade ground stretched before you, a wide rectangle of packed earth and sparse grass that had been worn down by boots and wagon wheels and the daily tread of hundreds of feet. In the dark, it seemed larger than it did by day, its far edges disappearing into a soft blackness that the lantern could not reach, and the buildings around its perimeter were nothing more than shapes, blocks of deeper shadow against a sky that held no moon yet. The officers' quarters sat to your left, a long, low building with a shingled roof and a row of small windows, most of them dark, though one at the far end still glowed with the faint, steady light of a candle, the silhouette of a man visible behind the curtain, sitting at a desk with his head bent over something unseen. The surgeon's hut was a smaller structure next to it, identifiable by the whitewashed stones around its door and the bundle of dried herbs hanging from a nail, their scent faintly medicinal when the breeze stirred. You walked across the parade ground at a slow, even pace, your boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch on the packed earth, and the sound was the only one you could hear besides the distant trickle of the river and the gentle creak of the flagpole rope against the wooden staff. The flagpole stood in the center of the ground, tall and straight, the halyard tapping against the wood with a light, hollow sound every time the air moved, which was not often. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy smell of pine needles and wet soil from the woods beyond the palisade, and you could feel it on your cheeks and on the backs of your hands, a coolness that was not cold enough to be uncomfortable, but just enough to keep you awake. The barracks building loomed to your right, a long rectangle of logs with a low roof and a row of shuttered windows, all of them closed now to keep in the warmth of the sleeping men inside. From within came a deep, steady sound, the combined breathing of 40 soldiers asleep in their bunks, a sound that rose and fell with a rhythm so slow and regular that it seemed to belong to the building itself rather than to any individual. Now and then someone would cough or shift in his sleep, the wooden bunks creaking softly, and then the breathing would settle back into its measured pattern. You passed the mess hall with its long tables and benches, the door closed and the windows dark, and then the bakehouse with its great clay oven, still faintly warm to the touch if you were close enough, the smell of yesterday's bread lingering around the door. The guardhouse sat near the main gate, a building of stone and timber, with a lantern burning inside, and a brazier of coals on the stone floor for the relief guard to warm their hands. You could see the duty corporal through the open doorway, a man sitting at a small table with a slate and a chalk stick, keeping the log of the watch. He glanced up as you passed, nodded once without speaking, and returned his attention to the slate, the chalk making a small, squeaking sound as he wrote. Near the guardhouse the main gate stood closed and barred, a double door of oak planks banded with iron, the enormous crossbar resting in its brackets, and beside it the wicket gate, a smaller door cut into the larger one, just large enough for a single man to pass through. The iron hinges had a faint coat of rust that made them creak when they moved, but now they were still, locks tight and silent. You turned toward the northwest corner of the fort, where the bastion projected outward from the palisade in a small angular platform of heavy timbers. A set of wooden stairs led up from the parade ground, their treads worn smooth and slightly hollowed in the centers, and you began to climb, the lantern swinging gently from your hand and sending its circle of light dancing against the log wall. The stairs creaked under your weight, each step making a sound that was part groan and part sigh, the voice of old wood settling into its joints. You counted the steps as you climbed, a habit you had fallen into without thinking, and the count reached 15 before you emerged onto the platform of the bastion. The post was a square of wooden planks laid across heavy beams, the whole structure projecting outward so that you could look both north toward the forest and west toward the river. A sentry box stood to one side, a small three-sided shelter with a sloping roof, empty now because the weather was fair, though you could use it if rain came. An iron hook had been driven into one of the timbers, and you hung the lantern there, adjusting it until it hung level and its light fell in a steady pool across the deck. The palisade continued around you, a wall of vertical logs sharpened at the top and set deep into the earth, their surfaces rough and splintered, coated in places with a dark, tarry substance that preserved the wood. You rested the butt of the musket on the deck and let the barrel lean against your shoulder, feeling the coolness of the iron through the wool of your coat, and you settled into the stillness of the watch. The first thing you noticed was the quiet. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, layered with many small sounds that you could only hear if you stopped moving and listened. The river below the bluff made a constant, liquid sound, a low murmur that rose and fell as the water moved over stones and around the roots of trees that grew along its banks. The forest beyond the cleared ground was a solid black wall of trees, but from it came the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant, soft hoot of an owl, a single note that repeated at long intervals. The air moved gently, so gently that it was more a suggestion than a wind, and when it touched your face, it brought the cool, clean scent of water and the faint, sharp smell of pine resin. You could hear your own breathing, slow and steady, and the soft sound of your coat sleeve brushing against the stock of the musket when you shifted your weight from one foot to the other. You let your eyes move slowly across the scene before you, taking in each part of it with the patience of a man who had many hours to fill. Directly ahead was the cleared slope that ran down from the palisade to the river, a distance of perhaps 300 yards of grass and low brush, cut back regularly by fatigue parties to deny cover to anyone who might approach the fort unseen. Beyond that was the river itself, a broad, dark ribbon of water that reflected no stars yet because the sky was overcast in patches, its surface moving with a slow, muscular current that you could just detect by watching a floating log or the way the moonlight, when it came, would break into shifting lines. On the far bank, the forest began again, a dense stand of pine and hardwood that climbed the ridge and vanished into the darkness of the higher ground. You turned your head slightly and looked to the west, where the river bent and the land opened into a wider valley. There you could see the faint, silvery outline of the water, where it caught the first light of the moon that was still below the horizon, a glow that was more felt than seen, a gradual lightening of the darkness near the horizon line. Above you, the sky was a deep, dark blue that was almost black, and the stars were sharp and numerous, scattered across the dome with no pattern that you could name, except for the Great Bear, the 7 stars that stood out clearly above the northern treetops. You traced the line of its tail and the bowl of its body, following the pointer stars to the North Star, which hung motionless directly above the flagpole, a fixed point in a sky that was, in all other respects, slowly turning. The first half-hour passed in this way, without event and without hurry. You stood with your hands resting lightly on the musket, your weight balanced evenly on both feet, and you simply watched. You watched the line where the cleared ground met the forest, a boundary that was sharp and distinct by day, but now blurred into a single darkness, the individual trunks invisible and only the mass of the canopy visible against the stars. You watched the surface of the river, noting the way the current created small whirls and eddies near the bank, the water moving around the fallen log that had been there since the spring floods, its bark stripped away and its wood bleached to the color of bone. You watched the low creeping mist that was beginning to form in the hollows, a thin white vapor that clung to the ground and moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a living thing that breathed and shifted in its sleep. The fort below you was quiet, but not entirely still. The buildings made their own small sounds, the timbers settling, the doors shifting in their frames, the wind stirring the thatch and shingles in tiny, scratching whispers. The chickens in the coop behind the bakehouse made a soft clucking and a rustling of feathers as they resettled on their perches, disturbed perhaps by a mouse or by a dream of grain. The quartermaster's cat, a lean grey tabby, appeared at the base of the palisade, its eyes catching the light from your lantern for a brief flash of green before it moved on, its paws silent on the packed earth, following some invisible trail of scent that led it around the corner of the storehouse and out of sight. The flagpole rope creaked again, a sound that was becoming as regular as the tick of the clock in the orderly room, and you realized that you could still hear that clock, its distant pendulum marking the seconds with a soft, metallic click that traveled across the parade ground and up to your post, muffled but unmistakable. You checked the musket's flint by touch, running your thumb over the sharp edge of the stone and finding it firm in the jaws of the cock, the leather pad still snug and the screw tight. You opened the pan cover slightly and peered inside, seeing the fine grey powder of the priming charge, dry and ready, and then you closed it again with a soft click. The cartridges in the box on your hip remained in their neat rows, and you counted them again, a mindless, soothing ritual, your fingers moving from hole to hole, finding each one full. The lantern candle burned steadily, its flame a tall teardrop shape of yellow and blue, and you trimmed the wick once with the small scissors that hung from a chain on the lantern's base, catching the blackened bit of thread and letting it fall to the deck where you would remember to sweep it up later. You called the half hour, your voice low and clear but not loud, pitched to carry to the guardhouse and no further. 10:30 and all's well, you said, and from the guardhouse came the acknowledging echo, the corporal's voice repeating the words, and then the quiet settled back over the fort like a blanket being pulled smooth. The sound of your own voice hung in the air for a moment and then dissolved into the night, and you returned to your watching, your eyes tracing the same paths over the landscape, from the tree line to the river, from the river to the stars, from the stars to the dark mass of the forest, and then back again, a slow, circular gaze that repeated itself with the regularity of the clock. The night deepened, though you could not have said exactly when it happened. The air grew slightly cooler, and the dew began to settle on the wooden planks of the bastion, a fine invisible film that would become visible only when the first grey light of dawn touched it. You felt it on the iron barrel of the musket, a coolness that was a degree or two lower than the air, and you wiped the moisture away with the cuff of your sleeve. A slow, absent gesture. The mist in the river valley thickened by gradual degrees, its top surface becoming more defined as it rose, a flat white layer that now reached the lower branches of the trees along the bank. The river's voice changed, becoming muffled as the mist absorbed the sound, and the world seemed to grow quieter still, the noises of the fort receding into a hush that was almost like sleep itself. You shifted your weight again, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a small creak through the wooden platform, and you began the first of your slow patrols along the parapet. The walkway that connected the bastion to the next corner was a narrow, elevated path of planks laid across the tops of the palisade logs, with a wooden rail on the inner side, to prevent a man from falling into the parade ground. You walked heel to toe, the boards giving slightly under each step, and you ran your left hand along the top of the palisade, feeling the rough, splintered texture of the sharpened points. Each log was a tree trunk cut and shaped by axe and adze, the tool marks still visible, the wood grain running in long vertical lines that your fingers traced without thought. You passed the iron brackets that held the logs together, the metal dark and pitted with age, and you noted the way the carpenters had joined the timbers at the corner, a dovetail joint fitted with wooden pegs that had swollen with the damp and now held tight. At the far end of your section, the parapet widened into a small platform where a brass 6-pounder cannon sat under its tarpaulin, the dark, humped shape of it like a sleeping beast. You paused there, checking that the champion was secure in the muzzle and that the touch-hole was covered with its lead apron, and then you turned and began the slow walk back, your shadow, cast by the lantern behind you, sliding along the palisade wall. You watched the shadow move, a long, dark shape that stretched and contracted as you passed, and you found the motion oddly calming, a visual echo of your own steady pace. Back at the bastion, you resumed your station, planted the musket butt on the deck, and let your gaze return to the tree line, where nothing moved except the mist and the slow, celestial turning of the night. The clock in the orderly room struck 11, a soft, single chime that resonated through the timbers of the fort, and you called out the hour in the all's well, your voice steady and unhurried. From the guardhouse came the reply, and from the other sentry posts around the perimeter came the faint, distant voices of the other men, each one calling in turn, a chain of sound that circled the fort and then faded. The night was still young, and you had many hours yet to stand in the quiet, with nothing to do but watch and listen and breathe the cool, damp air, while the fort slept around you, and the river ran its ceaseless course through the darkness below. The lantern burned on, the candle shortening by increments too small to see, and you waited with the patience of stone for the next half hour to arrive. The lantern hung from its iron hook with a steadiness that seemed almost unnatural, its flame burning upright and unwavering inside the horn panels, and the small circle of amber light it cast lay across the wooden planks of the bastion, like a pool of still water. You rested the butt of the musket on the deck, the iron-shod heel finding a slight depression in the wood that had been worn there by years of sentries doing exactly the same thing, and you allowed the weight of the weapon to settle into the planks so that your arms could relax, your hands remaining lightly on the barrel and the stock. The deck itself was built of heavy timbers laid side by side, their surfaces planed smooth long ago, but now textured by weather and boot leather, the grain raised in fine parallel ridges that you could feel through the soles of your shoes. In the joints between the planks, small gaps had opened over time, and through them you could see, if you looked straight down, the dark space beneath the bastion where the supporting beams crossed and the earth sloped away toward the palisade's base. You stood at the exact center of the bastion platform, a position that gave you a clear view of the cleared slope to the north and the river valley to the west, and you let your breathing slow until it matched the deep, unhurried rhythm of the night itself. The air was cool and damp in a way that spoke of a recent rain, though the rain had stopped hours before you came on duty, leaving behind only a clean, washed scent and a moisture that clung to every surface. The earth below the fort smelled of wet pine needles and leaf mold, a rich, dark aroma that rose from the forest floor and mixed with the sharper scent of the resin that beaded on the cut ends of the palisade lobs. You could detect the faint mineral smell of the river too, a cold, stony fragrance that drifted up from the water and mingled with the other scents until they became one single harmonious note, the smell of a quiet night in a wilderness fort. There was no wind at all, not even the slightest movement of air, and this absence of wind was a thing you noticed because it made every sound distinct and separate. The river below the bluff ran over a bed of rounded stones and ancient rock, producing a soft, continuous murmur that was less a sound than a presence, a low background tone that your ears accepted and then forgot, only to notice again whenever you deliberately listened for it. At the base of the palisade, in the cleared ground between the fort and the forest, the wet grass bent under its own weight, heavy with droplets of water that had not yet evaporated, and each blade glistened faintly when the lantern light caught it at the right angle. The forest itself was a solid wall of darkness, the trunks of pine and birch standing so close together that no light penetrated beyond the first row, and the canopy overhead was a black, jagged line cut against the starry sky like a silhouette made of ink. You noted the position of the sentry box to your right, a small three-sided shelter of wooden planks with a sloping roof that faced outward toward the forest. It was empty, its interior a dark rectangle of shadow, but you could see the wooden stool that sat inside, a simple three-legged thing with a seat worn smooth by the countless hours of men who had sat there during rainstorms or wet snow, listening to the drip of water from the roof and waiting for the weather to pass. The floor of the sentry box was raised slightly above the bastion deck, and a small wooden step led up to it, the edge of the step rounded and soft with age. Outside the box, nailed to one of the support posts, hung a small flat board on which the previous sentries had carved their initials or made tally marks, the cuts dark with old grease and dirt, a record of the many quiet nights that had come before this one. The worn path along the parapet was visible as a slight depression in the wood, a shallow groove that ran from the bastion platform along the elevated walkway toward the next corner of the fort. Countless boots had paced that path over the years, each step pressing the fibers of the wood a little more, until the surface had been compacted and polished to a smooth, darker shade that stood out against the rougher planks on either side. You could see the path curve gently as it followed the line of the palisade, and you knew that later, when you began your slow patrol, your own boots would fall into that same groove, following the track that others had made before you. Beside the sentry box, against the inner wall of the bastion, rested the heavy wooden bucket of sand. It was a simple bucket made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, and it was filled nearly to the brim with coarse brown sand that had been brought up from the riverbank. The sand was there for smothering accidental fires, a precaution that every sentry understood, and its surface was smooth and undisturbed, the grains catching the lantern light with a dull, granular sparkle. A small wooden scoop lay on top of the sand, its handle sticking up at an angle, and you noted its presence with the same calm attention you gave to everything else on the post, filing it away as one more detail in the complete inventory of your surroundings. You began, without hurry and without any particular intention, to count the vertical posts of the palisade that stood in your immediate view. The posts were the trunks of young trees, stripped of their bark and sharpened at the top into points, each one set deep into a trench and then backfilled with earth and stone, so that they stood straight and firm. You started at the corner post where the bastion joined the main wall and counted slowly, moving your eyes from one post to the next, each one about a foot wide and separated from its neighbor by a gap of no more than an inch, the gaps filled with chinking made of clay and moss. 1. A post that showed the mark of an old axe blade near its top, a diagonal scar that had weathered to a silvery grey. 2. A post that had a small knot near its midpoint, the wood around it whirled and dark. 3. A post that leaned inward by the slightest degree, a flaw so subtle that only a man standing still for hours would ever notice it. 4. A post that had been replaced more recently than the others, its surface still pale and fresh, not yet darkened by rain and sun. 5. A post that had a small patch of lichen growing on its north face, a crusty, grey-green circle that looked like a splash of old paint. You continued this quiet enumeration, the numbers forming in your mind without urgency, each one a small anchor that held your attention to the present moment. The moon had not yet risen. The horizon to the east was still dark, a deep, seamless black that gave no hint of the light to come, and because the moon was absent, the stars were unusually sharp and bright, their light undimmed by any competition. You tilted your head back slightly and looked up at the sky, a vast curved dome of deep indigo that seemed to press down on the earth with a gentle, weightless pressure. The Milky Way was visible as a faint, dusty band that stretched from the northern horizon to the south, a river of stars so dense and distant that they blended into a continuous glowing mist. Individual stars stood out with a clarity that made them seem closer than they were, each one a point of cold white light that twinkled steadily, their colors shifting from white to blue to a faint flickering red. You found the Great Bear above the treetops to the north, its 7 bright stars forming the familiar shape of a dipper, the handle curving down and the bowl tilting slightly, as if pouring its contents into the darkness below. You traced the line from the 2 pointer stars at the end of the bowl, Merak and Dubhe, following their direction until you reached the North Star, which sat fixed above the flagpole, a single, steady point that all the other stars seemed to circle around in their slow, imperceptible march. While you looked at the stars, you became aware of the steady, slow beat of your own heart. It was a sound you did not so much hear as feel, a deep, regular pulse that resonated through your chest and into the palms of your hands where they rested on the musket. Each beat came after a pause that was exactly the same length as the pause before it, a rhythm as ancient and reliable as the ticking of the clock in the orderly room, and you let your attention settle on it for a time, counting the beats in a quiet, internal way, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, the numbers repeating in a gentle loop. Your breathing fell into alignment with the heartbeat, each inhalation lasting for a count of 4 beats and each exhalation for another 4, and the effect was a deep, pervading calm that spread outward from your center until it seemed to fill the entire bastion and the night beyond it. The first half hour of a night watch was, you had learned, a lesson in absolute stillness, and you gave yourself over to that lesson now, with the patience of a man who knew that time would pass at its own pace and could not be hurried. You observed the world without moving, your head turning only by the smallest degrees, your eyes making slow, sweeping arcs across the landscape, as if you were reading a vast, quiet book. The cleared slope below the palisade was a study in shades of darkness, the grass a deep grey-green where the lantern light touched it, and a pure black where it fell into shadow. The river, visible as a broad, moving ribbon of darkest, wound through the valley floor, its surface reflecting no moonlight, but occasionally catching the faint, diffuse glow of the stars, a shimmer that came and went so quickly you were never quite sure you had seen it. The forest on the far bank was a solid mass of black, its individual trees invisible, its presence known only by the silhouette of its upper branches against the sky. Sounds came and went with a randomness that only seemed random because you did not know their causes. A twig snapped somewhere in the woods, A single, sharp crack that was followed by silence, and you did not startle or tense because the sound was small and distant and carried no threat. An owl called from the deeper forest, its voice a soft, hollow note that repeated 3 times and then stopped, leaving a silence that seemed deeper than before. The river murmured on, and in the pauses between your own breaths, you could hear the tiny, liquid sound of water dripping from the leaves of the undergrowth onto the wet earth, a sound so faint it was almost imaginary. The fort behind you breathed its sleeping breath, the timbers of the buildings contracting in the cool air with small, creaking sighs, and from the chicken coop came the soft, fluttering sound of feathers being ruffled and then smoothed. You turned your attention to the musket in your hands, feeling its weight and its texture as though you were encountering it for the first time. The walnut stock was smooth and cool, polished by hands and by the rubbing of wool coats, and the grain of the wood ran in fine dark lines that curved around the lock plate and the trigger guard. The iron barrel was cold to the touch, its surface blued to a deep charcoal black that swallowed the lantern light, and you ran a finger along the length of it, feeling the slight ridge of the front sight and the smooth curve of the muzzle. The flint in the jaws of the cock was a piece of dark, glassy stone, its edge sharp and true, and you checked it again by touch, a habitual gesture that required no thought. The cartridge box on your hip pressed against your side with a gentle, steady pressure, and you could feel the individual cartridges through the leather, their cylindrical shapes a familiar comfort. The heavy wooden bucket of sand caught your eye again, and you studied its construction in the slow, methodical way that the night allowed. The oak staves were held together by 3 iron hoops, the top and bottom hoops narrow and the middle one wider, each one rusted to a uniform, reddish-brown color that contrasted with the pale gray of the wood. The handle was a thick piece of rope that had been spliced and tarred, its fibers stiff and dark, and it lay flat against the side of the bucket, the ends knotted through holes drilled in the staves. The sand inside was not the fine white sand of a beach, but a coarse, gritty sand that contained small pebbles and fragments of shell, and it sparkled faintly in the lantern light, the individual grains catching the glow and throwing it back in tiny, scattered points. The wooden scoop was carved from a single piece of pine, its bowl worn thin from use and its handle darkened by the sweat of palms, and it rested on the sand at a slight angle, casting a small triangular shadow. You counted the palisade posts again, this time starting from the far end and working back toward the bastion, and you noticed details that you had missed the first time. One post had a small round hole drilled through it near the top, perhaps for a rope or a line that was no longer there, and the edges of the hole were smooth and weathered, as if the rope had rubbed against them for many years. Another post had a streak of dark stain running down its length, a stain that might have been from water seeping out of a knot, or from the sap of the tree itself, now hardened into a glossy amber trail. A third post had a small crescent-shaped mark near its base, the scar of a glancing blow from a shovel or an axe, a mark that had been there so long it was now part of the wood's character. You noted each of these things without judgment, simply observing them as they were, and the act of noticing filled the quiet minutes with a gentle, purposeless activity. The first half-hour of the watch drew to a close without any signal more dramatic than the slow internal sense that time had passed. You could not have said exactly how you knew, but something in the quality of the darkness had shifted, a subtle change that was not yet light, but a preparation for light, a loosening of the deepest black. The stars still shone, but perhaps they were a fraction less brilliant, or perhaps the sky behind them was a shade less dark. The mist in the river valley had thickened, its top surface now a flat white layer that hid the water and the lower slopes, and it was creeping slowly up the hill toward the fort, a silent, patient advance that would take hours to reach the palisade. The air was still and cool, the dew was gathering on every surface, and the lantern burned on with its steady amber flame, the candle within, shortened by a measure too small to see. You shifted your weight, feeling the wooden planks creak softly under your boots, and you settled deeper into the stillness, ready for the next half-hour and the one after that, the long, slow progression of a night that asked nothing of you but your presence and your patience. The darkness of the night watch had a texture to it, a quality that was not quite sound and not quite silence, but something in between, a dense, receptive stillness into which the smallest noises fell like stones into a pond, sending out ripples that faded slowly and left the surface smooth again. You stood at your post on the bastion with the musket resting against your shoulder and the lantern burning its steady amber glow, and you let your hearing reach out beyond the platform, beyond the palisade, into the deep, black bowl of the fort and the forest, collecting the tiny sounds that drifted up from the sleeping world. There was no need to name them or to sort them into categories, but the naming happened anyway, a quiet automatic process of recognition that turned the random murmurs into a familiar language, a language spoken by the fort itself as it breathed and settled through the long, slow hours of the night. From the barracks building behind you, the one that stretched along the eastern side of the parade ground with its row of shuttered windows and its low shingled roof, came the deepest and most constant of all the night sounds, the collective breathing of 40 men asleep in their bunks. It was a sound like the sea, a slow, rhythmic rise and fall that had no beginning and no end, the inhalation of 40 chests drawing air in a long, soft susurration, and the exhalation releasing it in a gentle, sighing outflow that seemed to stir the very timbers of the building. You could hear, if you listened very carefully, the way the breathing was not perfectly synchronized but layered, some men drawing breath while others released it, so that the overall effect was a continuous undulating wave that never stopped, a tide of air that washed against the log walls and then receded. Now and then a single breath would rise above the others, a deeper, rasping note from a man whose nose was perhaps slightly stopped, and then it would subside back into the general murmur, absorbed and smoothed over by the collective rhythm. A cough broke the surface occasionally, a single muffled bark that was quickly swallowed, and the wooden bunks creaked softly as a man shifted in his sleep, turning onto his side and pulling the wool blanket with him, the sound of the bunk frame a low, groaning note that lasted only a second and then was gone. The breathing continued indifferent to these small interruptions, its steady tidal motion, a reassurance that all within was well, that the men were resting, that the fort's human heart was beating in its slow, unconscious way. The flagpole in the center of the parade ground was a tall, straight mast of pine that had been stripped of its bark and set into a deep socket of stone, and it was never entirely silent. Even on a night as still as this one, when no wind moved across the open square, the pole emitted a sound that was part groan and part creak, a low, woody note that came from the fibers of the wood adjusting to the cool, damp air. The halyard, a thick rope of hemp that ran through a pulley at the top and was made fast to a cleat at the base, stirred against the pole with a faint brushing tap that repeated at irregular intervals, the rope's fibers stretching and contracting with the humidity. You could picture the halyard in the dark, its pale, twisted surface moving by fractions of an inch, the knot at the cleat holding firm while the upper portion swayed gently, and the pulley itself, a wooden wheel in an iron bracket, gave a tiny metallic chirp each time the rope slid through it, a sound so faint that you had to hold your breath to catch it. The flag, which hung furled and tied near the top of the pole, was a dark, shapeless bundle that contributed nothing to the soundscape, except the occasional soft flap of a loose corner of wool bunting stirring in a breath of air too small to feel, a sound like a distant hand brushing against cloth, there and then gone. In the officers' quarters, the long, low building with the shingled roof that sat opposite the barracks, a single window glowed with the dim, steady light of a candle still burning, and this light was accompanied by its own small symphony of sounds. The window was a small square of thick, greenish glass set in a wooden frame, and behind it, visible only as a faint, blurred silhouette, a man sat at a desk with his head bent over something, a book or a map or a stack of papers. You could not see the man clearly, but you knew he was there by the quality of the candlelight and by the occasional soft rustle of paper, a sound that came through the glass as a dry, whispery crackle, like leaves being turned in an autumn breeze. The candle on his desk would be a tallow dip or perhaps a beeswax taper, and its flame, though invisible to you from the bastion, would be a small, wavering tongue of yellow that cast moving shadows on the log walls and made the inkwell and the quill and the pewter cup gleam with a dull, liquid luster. The man would occasionally dip the quill and write something, the nib scratching across paper in a series of tiny, delicate strokes that you could almost imagine you heard, a sound that was too soft to carry across the parade ground, but which you supplied from memory, having heard it so often in the orderly room and the adjutant's office. The officer's chair creaked once, a sharp, brief complaint of wood underweight, and then the quiet returned, the candle burned on, and the silhouette remained motionless, a lonely, studious presence in the heart of the sleeping fort. Behind the bakehouse, a low stone structure with a clay oven and a wooden lean-to, the chickens were settled in their coop, a small slatted enclosure that smelled of straw and feathers and the warm, dusty scent of the birds themselves. The chickens were asleep on their perches, their heads tucked under their wings, but they were not entirely silent. From the co-op came a soft, continuous sound that was like a quiet conversation, a low, purring cluck that rose and fell as the birds dreamed their chicken dreams, and every so often one of them would shift on its perch, the claws gripping and re-gripping the wooden bar with a tiny, scratching rattle that was followed by a flutter of feathers as the bird resettled its wings and tucked its beak deeper into its plumage. The rooster, a large russet-colored bird with a comb like a red crown, made a sound that was not yet a crow, but a sort of low, inquiring gurgle, a sound that seemed to ask the night if it was time yet, and then he subsided, reassured by the darkness that the hour of his duty had not yet arrived. A mouse or a small rat moved through the straw bedding, its tiny feet making a sound like rain on a distant roof, a pattering that was there and then gone, and the chickens murmured again, a soft, bubbling sound that blended with the other night noises and became a part of the general, drowsy hum. The quartermaster's cat was abroad in the darkness, a lean grey tabby with pale green eyes, and a coat that blended into the shadows like smoke, and you caught sight of it now and then as it moved along the base of the palisade, its body a low, fluid shape that flowed over the ground with a grace that seemed almost liquid. The cat made no sound at all when it walked, its paws falling on the packed earth with a silence that was complete and absolute, but occasionally it would pause and look up at the palisade, its eyes catching the lantern light for a brief, startling flash of green, two small luminous coins that glowed for a moment, and then vanished as the cat turned its head and continued its patrol. Once you heard the faint, delicate sound of the cat's whiskers brushing against a blade of grass, a whisper so fine that it was almost imaginary, and another time you heard the soft, satisfied chirrup it made when it located the trail of the mouse that had been in the chicken coop, a sound like a tiny rolled note on a wooden flute. The cat disappeared around the corner of the storehouse, following its invisible path of scent, and you did not see it again for a long while, though you knew it was out there somewhere, a silent, self-contained hunter moving through the night with its own unspoken purpose. The river, which had been a constant low murmur at the start of your watch, had changed its voice as the mist thickened in the valley. The water still ran over the stones and around the fallen log near the bank, but the mist, a dense white layer that now filled the valley floor and hid the river from view, acted as a blanket that muffled and softened every sound that rose from the water. The river's voice, which had been a clear, liquid gurgle, became a distant, hushed hum, a sound like a finger rubbed around the rim of a crystal glass, continuous and soothing and without any sharp edges. You could still hear the occasional louder note, a small splash where a fish rose to the surface, or a section of bank slipped quietly into the current. But these sounds were flattened and blurred by the mist, arriving at your post as gentle, round tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fallen log that had been lodged near the water gate since the spring floods, its bark long stripped and its wood bleached to the color of old bone, contributed a steady gurgling trickle as the water flowed around its upstream end and created a small eddy, a sound that was like a continuous whispered conversation between the river and the wood, a soft, liquid murmuring that went on without pause and became, as you listened, as much a part of the silence as the silence itself. The clock in the commandant's house was the most precise and regular of all the night's voices, a steady, metallic heartbeat that reached your post from the far side of the parade ground with a clarity that the distance did not diminish. The commandant's house was a two-story structure of squared logs with a stone chimney and a front door painted a dark, dignified green. And inside the front parlor, on the mantel above the cold fireplace, sat a clock with a brass face and a pendulum that swung in a slow, deliberate arc, catching the light of a single, carefully shielded candle that was left burning all night for just this purpose. The pendulum was a disc of polished brass about the size of a man's palm, and it swung from left to right and back again, with a motion that was as smooth and silent as oil. But at the end of each swing, the escapement released with a soft, crisp tick, a sound that travelled through the wooden case, across the floorboards, out the slightly open window, and across the parade ground to where you stood. "Tick," it said, and then, after a pause that was exactly the same length as every other pause, "tock," and the two sounds together formed a pair, a couplet of time that repeated itself with a fidelity that was almost miraculous. You counted them now and then, not because you needed to know the hour, but because the counting was a restful, mindless activity, and you could follow the ticks for a minute or two and then let them fade back into the background, a metronome that kept the night's slow tempo without ever demanding your attention. There were other sounds too, smaller and more occasional, that you noticed only when the larger sounds had become so familiar that they no longer required conscious notice. The thatch on the roof of the bakehouse shifted slightly in a breath of air, the dried reeds rustling with a sound like a hand brushing over parchment. The blacksmith's forge, which was cold and dark at this hour, gave a soft pinging tick as the iron of the anvil or the tongs or the great bellows contracted in the cool night air. A single drop of condensed moisture fell from the roof of the sentry box onto the wooden deck, a tiny liquid plink that startled no one. From the guardhouse you heard the low murmur of voices as the relief guard talked quietly among themselves, words that were too distant to understand, but whose tone was calm and unhurried, the easy conversation of men who had nothing to do but wait for their own turn on the walls. All these sounds, the breathing and the coughing, the flagpole and the halyard, the officer's candle and his scratching pen, the chickens and the cat, the muffled river and the steady clock, blended together into a single continuous fabric, a tapestry of sound that wrapped the fort in a cocoon of gentle, reassuring noise. There was nothing alarming in any of it, nothing that required you to lift your head or tighten your grip on the musket, only the quiet, domestic music of a small community at rest. You let the sounds wash over you, a slow, auditory tide that rose and fell with the same patience as the night itself, and you felt yourself become a part of that tapestry, not a separate listener, but a thread, woven into the larger pattern, your own breathing joining the slow collective rhythm that rose from the barracks, your own heartbeat keeping time with the distant clock. The dark, cool air carried all of it to you, a symphony without a conductor, a language without words, and you understood it perfectly, a language that said over and over in its quiet way that all was well, that the fort was secure, that the night was passing in the only way it knew, slow and calm and full of the gentle noises of sleep. The hour had passed without event and without any signal more dramatic than the slow internal sense that your limbs had grown accustomed to stillness, that the wooden planks of the bastion had accepted your weight as a permanent part of their own, and that it was time to move. You straightened your spine by degrees, feeling the small, pleasant ache of muscles that had been holding a single position for a long while, and you lifted the butt of the musket from the deck, the iron shoe making a soft, scraping sound as it left the slight depression it had been resting in. The lantern remained on its hook, casting its amber pool of light across the platform, and you turned away from it, facing the narrow walkway that led from the bastion along the top of the palisade toward the next corner of the fort. This was the beginning of your sanctioned movement, the slow patrol that sentries had walked for years along this same section of wall, and you stepped onto the walkway with the measured, unhurried gait of a man who had many hours to fill and no need to rush through any of them. The walkway was a path of wooden planks laid across the tops of the palisade logs and supported by horizontal beams that projected inward from the wall, the whole structure raised high enough that you could look down into the parade ground on one side and out over the cleared slope on the other. The planks were wide, perhaps 2 feet across, and they'd been nailed down in a single row that followed the line of the wall. Each plank butted against its neighbor with a narrow gap that allowed rainwater to drain through. You began to walk slowly, placing your heel down first and then rolling forward onto the ball of your foot, a deliberate, rhythmic motion that sent a soft, muffled creak through the boards with each step. The wood gave slightly under your weight, a gentle, springy flex that was not a weakness but a sign of its resilience, and the planks responded with a sound that was part groan and part sigh, the voice of old timber that had learned to bend without breaking. You could feel the grain of the wood through the soles of your shoes, the alternating hard and soft bands of the growth rings, the texture of the plain surface worn smooth in the center and rough at the edges where the saw marks still showed. Your left hand reached out and touched the tops of the palisade logs as you warped, your fingers brushing lightly over the sharpened points that rose above the level of the walkway. The logs were the trunks of young pines and hemlocks, cut from the forest that surrounded the fort, and their upper ends had been shaped into blunt points with an axe, each facet of the cut showing the diagonal silvery scars of the blade. The wood was rough and splintered under your fingertips, the surface cracked by sun and rain into a network of fine, shallow fissures that ran with the grain, and you could feel the hard, resinous knots that stood proud of the surrounding wood, their surfaces glassy and dark. Some of the logs had been treated with a coating of pine tar, a thick, black substance that smelled of smoke and turpentine, and where the tar had dried, it had formed a hard, slightly tacky skin that caught the ridges of your fingerprints as you passed your hand over it. The sensation was a continuous, tactile record of the wall's condition, a report that your fingers read as clearly as your eyes could read a page, noting the soundness of each log and the places where decay or damage had begun to take hold. You moved heel to toe along the walkway, each step covering the same distance as the one before, and the rhythm of the movement settled into a kind of gentle pendulous swing, your body rocking slightly from side to side as your weight shifted from one foot to the other. The musket rested on your shoulder, its barrel pointing up into the dark sky, and the cartridge box swayed gently against your hip, the leather strap creaking with a soft, regular note that matched the cadence of your steps. You were not patrolling with any expectation of finding something amiss. You were patrolling because the patrol was part of the duty, a slow, circular activity that allowed you to inspect the defensive wall while also keeping your blood moving and your senses alert. The motion was repetitive without being monotonous, a gentle physical meditation that gave your body something to do while your mind remained calm and open, taking in the details of the night. The carpentry of the palisade revealed itself to you as you warped, the way the vertical logs had been joined to the horizontal beams, with a combination of wooden pegs and iron nails, each fastener a small, purposeful piece of the larger structure. The pegs were made of a hard, dark wood, perhaps locust or ironwood, and they had been driven into holes drilled through the beams and into the logs, their ends trimmed flush with the surface, but now slightly raised as the surrounding wood had shrunk over the years. You could feel the rounded heads of the pegs under your fingers, each one a smooth, slightly domed circle about the size of a shilling coin, the grain of the peg end visible as a tight concentric pattern of rings. The iron nails were larger and cruder, forged by the blacksmith in his shop from bars of raw iron, their shanks square and their heads irregular, beaten flat by the hammer. Some of the nail heads showed a faint plume of rust, an orange-brown powder that came off on your fingertips as a fine, gritty dust, and you noted which nails would need to be replaced before the rust worked its way deep into the wood and weakened the joint. The rust was not a sign of neglect, but a natural consequence of the damp, river air, and the fort's carpenters would attend to it in due time, pulling the old nails and driving new ones in their place, a task that was as regular and predictable as the changing of the guard. You paused for a moment at the place where the walkway widened slightly, allowing a sentry to pass another without having to squeeze against the palisade, and you looked down at the joint where two horizontal beams met at a corner post. The joint was a dovetail, a trapezoidal projection from one beam fitted into a corresponding socket in the other. the two pieces locked together without the need for nails or pegs, their fit so tight that you could barely see the line where they met. The carpenter who had made this joint had been a careful man, patient with his saw and his chisel, and the surfaces inside the joint were smooth and true, the wood fibers compressed and polished by the pressure of the fit. A thin smear of pine pitch, now hard and dark, sealed the seam against moisture, and you touched it with your finger, feeling the faint tacky give of the ancient resin. This joint had held for years, enduring the weight of snow and the push of wind, and it would hold for many years more, a small, hidden perfection that no one would ever see except the sentries who walk this wall at night. The air shifted as you continued along the walkway, a subtle, cool movement that came up from the river valley and slid across the parapet, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of the mist and the water. You felt it on your cheeks first, a coolness that was only a degree or two lower than the still air it displaced, and then you felt it touch your neck and the backs of your hands, a gentle, insubstantial pressure that was gone almost as soon as it arrived. The breeze, if it could be called a breeze, was just strong enough to stir the loose fibers of the wool coat that hung from your shoulders, the heavy red fabric shifting slightly with a soft brushing sound, and you were reminded, as you always were when the night air moved, of the weight and the texture of the garment that kept you warm. The coat was made of broadcloth, a dense, felted wool that had been fulled and napped until the surface was smooth and slightly fuzzy, and it was dyed a deep brick red that was almost black in the lantern light. The sleeves were lined with a lighter wool, and the collar was stiff and high, fastened with a hook and eye that you could feel against your throat. The coat had a good weight to it, a solid, comforting heft that pulled down on your shoulders and made you aware of your own body's size and shape, and it smelled of wood smoke and lanolin and the faint metallic tang of the brass buttons that ran down the front. You passed the midpoint of your section of the wall, a place where the walkway made a slight bend to follow the angle of the palisade, and you came upon the brass 6-pounder cannon that sat under its tarpaulin on a small, reinforced platform built out from the wall. The cannon was a dark, hulking shape that loomed out of the shadows, its barrel resting on its carriage and its muzzle pointing out toward the forest through a gap in the palisade that had been cut for just that purpose. The tarpaulin, a heavy sheet of canvas that had been painted with linseed oil to make it waterproof, was draped over the cannon and tied down with ropes that ran to iron rings set into the deck, and the whole arrangement gave the cannon the look of a sleeping animal, a beast of metal and wood that was resting with its limbs tucked under it. You stopped beside the cannon and knelt to check that the champion was secure in the muzzle, a wooden plug carved from a piece of soft pine that fit snugly into the bore to keep out rain and dust and nesting insects. The champion was in place, its outer face painted white so that it could be seen in the dark, and you pressed on it gently with the heel of your hand to be sure it was tight, feeling the slight, springy resistance of the wood against the iron. You also checked the lead apron that covered the touch hole, a small square sheet of soft metal that was kept in place by a weighted leather thong, and you found it lying flat and secure, its surface cool and smooth under your fingers. The cannon was ready as it always was to be loaded and fired if the need arose, but the need had never arisen, and you stood up again, patting the cold, curved barrel once with a palm that came away smelling faintly of brass and oil. The far corner of your patrol was a small, square platform that mirrored the bastion you had left, though it was simpler and smaller, with no sentry box and no bucket of sand, just a bare deck of planks and a wooden rail that ran around the inner edge. You reached it after a walk that had taken perhaps 10 minutes, and you turned there, reversing your course with the same slow, deliberate movements that had brought you to this point. Your shadow, which had been trailing behind you as you walked, now stretched out ahead, cast by the lantern that still hung on its hook back at the bastion, and you watched it slide along the surface of the palisade wall as you began the return journey. The shadow was a long, dark shape that rippled and bent as it passed over the uneven surfaces of the logs, elongating when it crossed a gap and contracting when it fell on a projecting knot or a bolt head. It moved with a silence that was complete, a silent companion that mimicked your every step and gesture, and you found yourself watching it with a calm, distant interest noting the way the outline of the musket on your shoulder appeared as a thin, straight line, and the way your hat brim created a curved crescent shape that bobbed gently with your stride. The shadow was a part of you and also not a part of you, a temporary projection that would vanish the moment the lantern was extinguished. But while it lasted, it was a faithful, silent partner in the slow, pendular walk along the wall. You continued your inspection as you walked back toward the bastion, your left hand once again trailing along the tops of the palisade logs, your eyes scanning the surface of the wall for any sign of damage or wear. You noticed a place where the chinking the mortar of clay and moss that filled the gaps between the logs had fallen out in a small, crumbled heap on the walkway, leaving a narrow vertical slit through which you could feel a thread of cold air when you held your hand near it. This was a minor repair, a task for the next day's fatigue party, a man with a bucket of clay and a trowel who would pack the gap full and smooth it over, and you made a mental note of its location, measuring the distance from the corner post in paces so that you could report it to the corporal when the watch was over. A little farther on, you found a place where a musket ball had struck the palisade long ago, perhaps during a practice firing or a moment of alarm that had never been recorded, and the ball had embedded itself in the wood, a dark flattened circle of lead that was now surrounded by a faint, radiating pattern of cracks. You touched the ball with your finger, feeling its cold metallic smoothness and the slight raised lip of the wood around it, and then you moved on, your steps carrying you forward with the same measured, unhurried pace. The air was cooler now than it had been at the start of your watch, and you could feel the cold radiating from the palisade logs as you walked beside them, a chill that seeped through the wool of your coat and made you aware of the layers of clothing you wore beneath it, the linen shirt and the waistcoat, and the knitted stockings that covered your legs. The dew had begun to settle more heavily on the wooden surfaces, and your boots left faint, dark footprints on the planks where the moisture was disturbed, prints that would evaporate as soon as the morning sun touched them. You breathed in the cool, damp air, feeling it fill your lungs with a clean, sharp freshness, and you exhaled slowly, the breath forming a faint, white mist that dissipated almost instantly. The walkway continued before you, a straight, narrow path of dark wood and deeper shadow, and you followed it with the patience of a man who knew that the night was long and that there was no destination to reach except the one you had already left. The bastion with its lantern and its bucket of sand and its view of the river and the forest and the slow, turning stars. The 2-hour mark of the watch arrived without announcement, a quiet turning point that you felt in the subtle lengthening of your shadow and the way your stomach had begun to register a faint, hollow awareness of the hours since the last meal. The night had settled into its deepest phase, the stars still bright but now shifted in their slow arc across the sky, the mist in the river valley a thick white blanket that hid the water completely, and the sounds of the fort had become so familiar that you no longer heard them as separate events, but as a continuous, woven fabric of gentle noise. You were standing at the bastion, having completed another slow circuit of the parapet, and you had just resettled the musket against your shoulder when you heard the soft, deliberate tread of boots on the wooden stairs that led up from the parade ground, a sound that was not the random creak of settling timber, but the measured, purposeful approach of another person. The corporal of the guard emerged onto the platform, his figure first a dark shape against the deeper darkness of the stairwell, and then a solid, recognizable form as he stepped into the circle of lantern light. He was a man of medium height, with a face that had been weathered by years of sun and wind into a permanent, reddish-brown hue, and he wore his red coat buttoned all the way to the throat, the crossbelt, a clean, white stripe across his chest, the brass buckle polished to a dull gleam. In one hand he carried a small slate with a chalk stick tied to it by a string, and in the other he held a tin cup by its handle, the metal dark and dented, steam rising from the surface in the thin, curling wisp that caught the lantern light and turned it into a tiny, drifting ribbon of silver. He did not speak immediately, and you did not expect him to, for the rituals of the night watch were conducted with a quiet economy of words, everything important communicated through gestures and familiar actions. He handed you the cup, and you received it with both hands, feeling the heat of the metal press against your palms and fingers through the wool of your gloves, a warmth that was almost startling in its intensity after the long, cool hours of standing still. The cup was an ordinary tin vessel, its sides slightly battered and its rim bent in one place where it had been dropped long ago, and the coffee inside was black and steaming, its surface a dark liquid mirror that reflected the lantern flame as a tiny, trembling point of light. You lifted the cup to your face and inhaled, the steam moistening your nostrils and carrying a scent that was rich and bitter and faintly smoky, the smell of beans that had been roasted dark and ground coarse and boiled in a pot over an open fire. The first sip was a cautious one, the liquid hot enough to make you pull back slightly and blow across the surface, sending small ripples racing from one side of the cup to the other, and then you drank again, a deeper swallow that filled your mouth with a strong, earthy flavor that had no sweetness at all, only the clean, sharp bitterness of the bean, and the faint, metallic tang of the tin cup. The heat traveled down your throat and settled in your stomach, a small warm core that seemed to radiate outward, pushing back against the cool, damp air and making you aware for the first time in hours of just how cold your fingers had become. The corporal took the musket from you with a practiced ease, his hands moving through the inspection with a speed that came from long habit. He checked the flint first, using his thumb to test the sharpness of the edge and the tightness of the leather pad that held it in the jaws of the cock, and he gave a small, satisfied nod, a gesture so slight it was almost invisible. He opened the pan cover and peered inside, tilting the musket so that the lantern light fell on the fine grey powder of the priming charge, and then he closed the cover again with a soft, precise click that was the only sound the metal made. He ran his hand along the barrel, feeling for moisture, and then he checked the cartridges in the box at your hip, lifting the flap and counting the paper tubes with a quick, efficient touch, his lips moving silently as he tallied them. Satisfied, he picked up his slate and made a small, neat mark with the chalk, a vertical line that joined a row of other vertical lines, each one representing a sentry whose post had been inspected, whose weapon was in good order, whose watch was proceeding without incident. The chalk made a soft, scratching sound on the slate, a sound that was dry and precise, and then the corporal tucked the slate under his arm and looked at you with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained a quiet, unspoken acknowledgment that all was well. He said, in a voice that was low and pitched to carry no farther than the bastion, that you were relieved for 10 minutes, that a man named Hutchins was waiting at the bottom of the stairs to stand your post, and that you should go to the guardhouse to warm yourself at the brazier. You nodded, handed him the cup, which you had emptied except for a small, dark puddle of grounds that clung to the bottom, and you walked to the head of the stairs, your boots making the same soft, creaking sounds on the planks that they had made all night. The stairs were narrow and steep, the treads hollowed by years of use, and you descended them carefully, one hand on the railing, the lantern light from the bastion fading behind you as you went down into the darker air of the parade ground. At the bottom of the stairs, a man stood waiting, a soldier named Hutchins whom you recognized from your company, a young man with a round, open face and a thick wool scarf wrapped around his neck against the chill. He held his own musket and wore his coat buttoned and his hat pulled low, and he gave you a small, wordless nod as you passed, a gesture that said he understood the post was now his for the brief duration of your absence. You watched him climb the stairs, his boots making the same sounds yours had made, and then you turned and walked across the parade ground toward the guardhouse, the packed earth hard and cold under your feet, the flagpole creaking softly to your left, the officer's candle still burning in its distant window, a small, steady point of light that seemed to float in the darkness like a star that had fallen to earth. The guardhouse was a low stone building that sat near the main gate, its walls made of river rocks fitted together with mortar, and its roof of heavy split-wood shingles that had weathered to a uniform silvery grey. A lantern burned on a hook beside the door, casting a pool of yellow light that spilled out onto the packed earth, and the door itself stood slightly open, a gap of warm, smoky air escaping into the night. You pushed the door open with the flat of your hand, feeling the rough, splintery surface of the wood and the cold iron of the latch, and you stepped inside, ducking your head slightly under the low lintel, into a room that was warm and dim and full of the quiet, waiting presence of other men. The guardhouse was a single room, not large, with a floor of packed earth that had been swept clean and a low ceiling of exposed beams from which hung bundles of dried herbs and a spare lantern and a coil of rope. In the center of the room, on a raised hearth of flat stones, a brazier of coals glowed with a deep, steady red, the heat rising from it in a continuous, invisible column that made the air shimmer slightly when you looked through it. Around the brazier, on wooden benches that had been pushed back against the walls, sat the men of the relief guard, perhaps 6 or 7 of them, their muskets stacked in a neat triangular pile in the corner, their coats unbuttoned, their hats removed and resting on their knees or on the bench beside them. They talked quietly among themselves, their voices a low, continuous murmur that filled the room like the sound of a distant stream, and the smell of the room was a rich, layered thing composed of wood smoke and wool, of leather and boot polish, of the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco that clung to the beams and the walls, and the clothing of the men. You found a space on one of the benches, a section of smooth, worn wood near the wall, and you sat down with a sigh that was not of weariness but of simple physical release, the muscles of your legs and back relaxing as you took your weight off your feet for the first time in 2 hours. The bench was hard and unyielding, but it felt good to sit, and you stretched your legs out slightly, crossing your ankles, feeling the cool air of the room against your face, while the warmth of the brazier radiated against your shins and knees. You removed your gloves and held your hands out toward the coals, the heat washing over your fingers in a slow, penetrating wave that made the skin tingle and prickle, and you watched the coals shift and settle, the red glow pulsing gently as a small piece of ash fell away and revealed a fresh, bright layer beneath. The low conversation of the guards drifted around you, words that were spoken in murmurs and half-sentences, the kind of talk that men engaged in when they were passing time and had no need to be heard or remembered. Someone mentioned the weather, observing that the mist was thicker tonight than it had been the night before, a comment that was met with a general murmuring agreement and a silence that lasted for a long, comfortable moment before another voice spoke up, a man who wondered aloud whether the supply wagon from the settlement would arrive by Thursday or whether the rains had washed out the road again. Another man, older, with a voice that was roughened by years of shouting orders, replied that the road was passable enough and that the wagon would come when it came, which was a truth that required no further discussion. A third voice, younger and softer, said something about the condition of the bread, that the last batch from the bakehouse had been a little heavy, a little dense, and the older voice agreed and said that the yeast was perhaps getting old and would need to be refreshed from the settlement stores. The words drifted through the warm, smoky air like leaves on a slow current, rising and falling, overlapping and separating, and you listened without really listening, letting the sound wash over you as you stared into the red, pulsing heart of the brazier. In the corner of the guardhouse, near the door that led to the small inner room where the duty corporal kept his desk and his logbook, you could see the man himself, the same corporal who had brought you the coffee, now seated on a stool with his slate put aside and the large leather-bound logbook open before him on a tilted stand. He had a quill pen in his hand, and he was writing in the book with slow, careful strokes, the nib dipping into the inkwell after every few words, the pen scratching across the page with a sound that was sharp and crisp in the quiet room, a sound that cut through the murmur of voices like a needle through cloth. You watched him write, his face illuminated by a single candle that sat on the corner of the desk, the flame reflecting in his eyes as he worked, and you could see the concentration in the set of his jaw and the way his tongue touched the corner of his mouth. He was entering the details of the watch, the time which was 2 in the morning exactly, the status of the sentries which was all secure, the condition of the wind which was calm, and the temperature which he'd obtained from the small brass thermometer that hung on the wall beside the desk, its mercury column settled at 48 degrees. Each entry was made in a neat, precise hand, the letters small and even, the line straight, and the ink was a dark glossy black that shone for a moment before it soaked into the paper and became permanent. The scratch of the pen was the dominant sound in the guardhouse, louder than the murmur of voices and the crackle of the coals. A steady, rhythmic scratching, that had the same quality as the ticking of the clock, a sound that marked the passage of time not in seconds, but in strokes of ink. You listened to it as you warmed your hands, counting the strokes without meaning to. Each one a small, deliberate act of record-keeping that would be read by the captain in the morning and then filed away in the orderly room, a permanent record of a quiet night. The pen reached the end of a line and the corporal paused, dipping the nib into the inkwell with a tiny liquid sound, tapping the excess ink against the rim, and then he resumed writing, the scratching starting again, regular and unhurried. The brazier coals settled with a soft, rustling sigh, sending a small shower of sparks up toward the ceiling, and one of the men on the bench beside you, a soldier with a scar across his knuckles, leaned forward and used a pair of iron tongs to lift a fresh piece of charcoal from a basket on the floor, placing it carefully on top of the glowing pile. The new coal was black and cold, but within a few seconds it began to crackle and pop, small flames licking around its edges, and then it caught with a soft, hoofing sound and began to glow, adding its warmth to the warmth of the others. The man sat back, satisfied, and resumed the quiet conversation, which had now turned to the topic of the fort's cat, and whether it had caught the rat that had been seen near the stores, a discussion that was conducted in the same low, murmuring tones as everything else. Your 10 minutes passed in this gentle, undemanding way, the warmth of the fire soaking into your bones, the voices of the men a soft, continuous lullaby, the scratch of the pen a steady metronome that marked the slow, even flow of time. You could have sat there for much longer, letting the heat and the quiet wrap around you like a blanket, but the 10 minutes were a fixed, allotted span, and when you felt them drawing to a close, you stood up from the bench with a slow, deliberate movement, your knees and back making the small, creaking sounds of muscles that had been briefly at rest. You pulled your gloves back on, the wool still warm from the brazier, and you adjusted your crossbelt, settling the leather strap across your chest so that it lay flat and even, the brass plate centered, and the buckle secure. You walked to the door of the guardhouse, stepping around the stacked muskets in the basket of charcoal, and you paused for a moment with your hand on the latch, looking back at the quiet, peaceful scene. The men on their benches, the corporal at his desk, the coals glowing in their hearth, and you felt a small, quiet gratitude for the brief respite. A gratitude that had no words and required none. Then you pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold, dark air of the parade ground. The contrast sharp and bracing, the warmth of the guardhouse falling away from you like a cloak being lifted. You walked across the packed earth toward the stairs of the northwest bastion, your steps steady and slow, the warmth of the coffee and the brazier still a small glowing presence in your stomach, a gentle steadying heat that would stay with you for the remaining hours of the watch. The stars were still bright overhead, the mist still thick in the valley, the clock still ticking in the commandant's house, and you climbed the stairs with the same measured pace you had used all night, ready to resume your post and continue the long, quiet vigil until the dawn. The coffee had left a residual warmth that settled deep in your stomach, a small, steady ember that radiated a gentle heat through your core as you resumed your place on the bastion platform. Hutchins, the young soldier who had stood your post during the brief relief, gave you a quiet nod and handed back the musket, the transfer as smooth and wordless as the passing of a baton in a relay race that had no finish line. He disappeared down the stairs with the same soft, creaking tread that all the sentries used, and you were alone again with the lantern and the palisade and the vast dark bowl of the sky overhead. Something had changed while you were in the guardhouse, a shift so subtle that it took you a moment to identify it, and then you looked to the east and saw that the moon had risen at last. The moon was a waning crescent, a thin, curved blade of silver that hung low above the dark line of the eastern hills, its lower tip just clearing the treetops and its upper tip pointing toward the zenith, like the prow of a ghostly ship. It was not yet high enough to cast strong shadows, but its light was enough to change the quality of the darkness, turning the solid black of the forest into a deep, textured grey and picking out the edges of the palisade logs with a faint, silvery rim that ran along each sharpened point. The river, which had been invisible in the mist-filled valley for hours, now showed itself as a distant, moving ribbon of light where the moonlight touched the water through a thin place in the fog, a shimmer that was pale and cold and utterly serene. The mist itself had taken on a new character in the moonlight, its flat, white surface now glowing with a soft, pearlescent luminescence that made it look like a sea of milk, still and silent, filling the valley from edge to edge. You turned your attention upward, letting your gaze leave the earthly boundaries of the fort and the forest, and you looked at the sky with the same patient, methodical attention you had given to the palisade and the parade ground. The moon, though the dominant feature, was only one element in a vast, rotating clockwork that had been turning overhead since long before the fort was built and would continue turning long after its timbers had rotted into the earth. The stars around the moon were dimmed by its light, their brilliance washed out by the silver glow that surrounded the crescent like a faint, circular halo. But away from the moon, in the darker regions of the sky, the stars remained sharp and numerous, their light undiminished by any earthly competition. The night was at its deepest phase now, that period of maximum darkness that occurs in the small hours when the world is most fully turned away from the sun, and the stars seem to respond by shining with a particular crystalline intensity, each point of light a tiny, perfect diamond set into the velvet dome. You found Cassiopeia easily, the 5 bright stars that formed a distinctive W shape in the northeastern sky, the constellation named for a queen of ancient myth, whose name and story had been carried across oceans and centuries to this quiet place. The W was tilted on its side now, one arm pointing down toward the horizon and the other reaching up toward the zenith, and you traced its outline with your eyes, connecting the 5 stars in their familiar pattern, a shape that was as recognizable as a friend's face. Cassiopeia was climbing steadily as the night progressed, its slow ascent a function of the Earth's rotation, and you could see, if you compared its current position to where it had been when you first came on duty, that it had moved by a distance equal to the width of your hand held at arm's length, a measure that the astronomers called a span. The motion was too slow to perceive in the moment, like the motion of the hour hand on a clock, but its cumulative effect was unmistakable, a steady, silent march that carried the entire celestial sphere from east to west with a patience that was beyond human measure. The North Star, that fixed and constant point around which all the other stars appeared to revolve, sat exactly where it had been when you first looked for it, directly above the tip of the flagpole, as motionless as the pole itself. You could see how the nearby stars, the fainter ones that were close to the pole, traced small invisible circles around it, their paths so tight and slow that only the most careful observation over many hours would reveal their movement. The Great Bear, which had been directly above the northern treetops at the start of your watch, had pivoted significantly, its handle now pointing more toward the west and its bowl tilted at a different angle, pouring its imagined contents not into the darkness below, but toward the horizon that would soon, though not yet, begin to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The motion of the Great Bear was the motion of the entire sky, a slow, grand rotation that carried everything with it. The constellations and the planets and the moon itself, all of them passengers on a vast, silent carousel that turned once every day and night without fail. A single planet, bright and unwavering, sat low on the western horizon, its light a steady, golden white point that did not twinkle the way the stars did. You knew it was a planet because of that steady light, the twinkling of stars being caused by the Earth's atmosphere, while the planets, being closer and appearing as tiny disks rather than points, were less affected by the air's disturbance. You recall the astronomy lessons from the long sea voyage that had brought you to this continent, the nights spent on the deck of a transport ship, with a young officer who had a brass telescope and a passion for the celestial bodies, pointing out the planets and the constellations to any soldier who cared to listen. He had named the planets one by one: Jupiter, with its bands of color, Saturn with its rings, Venus blazing in the evening or the morning sky, and Mars with its faint reddish hue, and he had spoken of their distances and their orbits in a calm, educated voice that had been as soothing as the sound of the waves against the hull. The planets you were looking at now might have been Jupiter, or perhaps Saturn, though you could not be certain without the telescope, and the uncertainty did not matter in the least, for the simple presence of the planet, Its steady, patient light was enough to connect this quiet bastion on a colonial fort to the vast, orderly machinery of the solar system. The Milky Way stretched across the sky from south to north, a faint, dusty band of light that was the accumulated glow of millions of stars, too distant to be seen individually. Their light blended together into a soft, continuous river that mirrored the earthly river flowing through the valley below. On a night with no moon, the Milky Way was bright enough to cast a faint shadow, but tonight, with the crescent moon rising, it was more subtle. A delicate, gauzy veil laid across the heavens, its edges soft and indistinct, its core a slightly brighter, more concentrated line of pale, silvery light. You could see dark patches within the band, places where clouds of interstellar dust blocked the light of the stars behind them, creating shapes and voids that had no names but were beautiful in their quiet, abstract way. The astronomers who had studied the Milky Way had discovered that it was the plane of the galaxy, a vast rotating disk of stars and dust and gas, and that the sun itself was one small star among those millions, orbiting the center of the galaxy in a journey that took hundreds of millions of years to complete. The thought was too large to hold for more than a moment, a brief, dizzying glimpse of a scale that made the fort and the forest and the entire continent seem like a speck of dust on a vast, dark sea. And you let it go, returning your attention to the simple visible fact of the Milky Way's presence, a faint, beautiful band of light that stretched across the night like a silent promise. An occasional meteor drew a swift, silent line across the darkness, a brief white streak that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, its entire existence measured in fractions of a second. You watched for them, knowing that they were bits of cosmic dust burning up in the atmosphere, small, ancient particles that had traveled through space for eons only to end their journey in a brief, brilliant flash above a sleeping fort in a wilderness that had no name for them. Each meteor was unique, some faint and quick, barely visible at the edge of your vision, others brighter and slower, leaving a glowing trail that persisted for a heartbeat or two before fading. There was no pattern to their appearance, no way to predict when the next one would come, and so you simply watched and waited, your gaze soft and unfocused, ready to catch the next brief, silent visitor whenever it chose to arrive. The stillness of the air was now complete, a profound, windless calm that allowed you to feel, or perhaps only to imagine that you felt, the immense, slow spin of the earth beneath your feet. The sensation was not a physical one, but a conceptual one, a quiet awareness that the solid ground on which you stood was not solid at all, but was a sphere of rock and water, and air turning steadily through the void of space, carrying the fort and the forest and the river and the moon and all the stars of the visible sky with it. The motion was so smooth and so constant that no instrument made by human hands could detect it directly, and yet its effects were visible everywhere you looked, in the slow climb of Cassiopeia and the pivot of the Great Bear and the gradual westward drift of the planet on the horizon. The Earth was a ship, you thought, a ship of immense size and perfect stability, sailing through a sea that had no shores and no bottom, and you were a passenger on its deck, a sentry on a bastion that was itself a tiny wooden projection on the surface of that great spherical vessel. The thought was a calming one, reducing all human concerns to their proper scale, which was very small, and placing the quiet night watch in a context that was as large and as peaceful as the universe itself. The moon continued to rise, climbing clear of the hills and the clinging mist, its crescent shape now sharp and distinct, a perfect arc of silver light that outlined a dark, ghostly disk, the unlit portion of the moon's face visible by the faint grey glow of earthshine, the reflected light of the earth itself shining back onto the lunar surface. You could see the larger features of the moon's face even in that dim illumination, the dark, smooth plains that the early astronomers had called seas, though they were dry and airless and ancient beyond all human reckoning. The sea of tranquility was there, and the sea of serenity, and the ocean of storms, names that had been given by men who looked at the moon through the first crude telescopes and imagined that its dark patches were bodies of water, an error that had been corrected but whose poetry had been preserved. The crescent itself was a landscape of craters and mountains, the line between light and dark, which the astronomers called the Terminator, sharply defined, each crater rim and mountain peak catching the slanting sunlight and casting long black shadows across the surrounding plains. You could not see these details with your unaided eyes, but you knew they were there, and the knowledge was enough. A quiet, intellectual appreciation of the moon's true nature that added depth to the simple, visual pleasure of its silver light. Back on Earth, the fort below you had grown quieter still, the sounds of the sleeping men and the settling timbers fading into a hush that was as deep as the silence between the stars. The officers' candle had been extinguished at last, the window in the officers' quarters now dark and indistinguishable from all the other dark windows, and the chickens in their coop had fallen into a deeper, more complete sleep, their soft clucking murmurs silent. The cat had returned from its patrol and was now curled on a sack of flour in the storehouse, its tail wrapped around its nose, its green eyes closed. The river, still muffled by the mist, made a sound that was less a sound than a memory of a sound, a low, continuous hum that was indistinguishable from the silence itself. The clock in the commandant's house ticked on, its pendulum swinging in the dark parlor, the sound traveling across the parade ground with the same steady, regular cadence, a heartbeat that kept time for the sleeping fort while the stars turned overhead and the moon climbed toward its zenith. You stood motionless, the musket resting against your shoulder, your hands lightly on the stock and the barrel, and you let the vast, slow clock of the heavens occupy your attention entirely. The stars and the moon and the planets and the meteors, all moving in their silent, predictable paths, a celestial machinery that asked nothing of you but your witness. The night had passed its midpoint and was now sliding gently, imperceptibly, toward the distant dawn, and you were exactly where you needed to be, a single, still point of consciousness anchored to a wooden bastion on a small sleeping fort, watching the universe turn with a patience that matched its own. The view from the bastion offered not only the wide, dark expanse of the forest and the river, but also, when you turned your head and looked down over the inner rail, a clear and comprehensive prospect of the fort's interior, laid out in its orderly rectangle like a diagram in a military manual. The parade ground occupied the center, a broad open square of packed earth and sparse grass that was now empty and still, its surface marked by the faint, parallel lines of wagon tracks and the countless overlapping impressions of boot soles, all softened by the thin, silvery wash of moonlight that had begun to reach into the enclosure as the crescent climbed higher. Around this central space, arranged in a neat and purposeful order, stood the buildings of the garrison, each one placed according to its function, and from your elevated post you could see them all as distinct, silent shapes, their roofs dark against the darker ground, their doors and windows closed and secured for the night. The sense of order was immediate and deeply calming, a visible expression of the careful planning that had gone into the fort's construction, every structure and every path and every pile of stores arranged with a logic that was as satisfying as it was simple. Directly below you, at the northern end of the parade ground, stood the main gate, the only point of entry and exit for the entire fortification, a formidable barrier of oak and iron that faced the river and the wharf where the supply boats tied up. The gate was a double door, each leaf made of thick, vertical planks of oak that had been sawn from the heartwood of old trees, their surfaces dark with age and cross-banded with heavy iron straps that ran horizontally and diagonally, bolted through with square-headed nails whose points were clenched over on the inside. The ironwork was black and pitted, showing the faint, orange bloom of rust in a few places, but the metal was still sound, still capable of turning a musket ball or resisting a crowbar, and the joints where the straps overlapped were reinforced with additional plates and rivets. The two leaves met in the center with a tight, seamless join, their edges beveled so that they fit together without a gap, and the whole assembly was framed by a massive timber arch that rose above the gate and supported the weight of the palisade. You could see the wicket gate cut into the right-hand leaf, a smaller, man-sized door with its own iron hinges and its own lock, and just inside the wicket, in a small stone-paved alcove, the guard detail assigned to the gate were asleep on cots that had been pushed against the wall. The guard detail were 3 men, visible to you as dark, bundled shapes wrapped in grey wool blankets their muskets resting in a rack bolted to the stonework and their accoutrements hung on pegs above their heads. One of the men had his face turned toward the alcove's single-shuttered lantern, and you could see the faint, peaceful outline of his features, the closed eyes, the slack jaw, the slow, regular rise and fall of his chest under the blanket. Another man lay on his back with one arm thrown over his head, his hand resting on the stock of a pistol that was tucked under his pillow, a precaution that was more habit than necessity. The third man was curled on his side, facing the wall, his breathing deep and slow, and the three of them together formed a small human tableau of complete and trustful rest, trusting in the sentries on the walls and the strength of the barred gate behind them. The enormous timber that served as the crossbar rested in its iron brackets just above the cots, a beam of oak that was a full foot square and 15 feet long, its ends shaped to fit into sockets in the stone walls on either side of the gate passage, and it was lowered into place each night by a simple system of ropes and pulleys that allowed 2 men to manage its weight. The beam was dark and smooth, polished by the hands that had lifted and lowered it for years, and it sat in its brackets with a solid, immovable finality that said the gate was closed and would not be opened until the morning. Beyond the gate, on the western side of the parade ground, the quartermaster's store stretched along the palisade in a long, low shed built of squared timbers and roofed with split wood shingles that had weathered to a uniform, silvery grey. The store had no windows, only a single wide door that was secured with a heavy padlock and a bar of iron. But you knew its interior as well as you knew the interior of your own barracks, having spent many hours there on fatigue duty, moving barrels and counting sacks and checking the contents of crates against the quartermaster's lists. Inside, the store was arranged with a meticulous precision that bordered on art, the floor swept clean, and the stores organized by type and by date, the oldest provisions placed at the front to be used first and the newest at the back. Barrels of salt pork stood in a row against the left-hand wall, each barrel made of white oak staves and bound with iron hoops, the wood stained dark where the brine had seeped through over time, and each barrel was branded on its head with the broad arrow of the king's mark and the initials of the supplying contractor and the year of packing. The salt pork inside was packed in layers, each piece of meat rubbed with coarse grey salt and pressed down tightly to exclude the air, and the brine that filled the spaces between the pieces was a thick amber liquid that smelled of salt and smoke and the faint, sweet scent of preserved meat. Next to the pork barrels were the barrels of salt beef, larger and darker, their hoops heavier and their wood thicker. The beef inside a deep mahogany red that had been cured with saltpeter as well as salt, giving it a firm, dense texture that would soften only after hours of boiling. Beyond the beef were the flour barrels, small and neat, each one containing 100 weight of fine white wheat flour that had been milled at the settlement and shipped upriver in flatboats, the barrels stamped with the miller's mark and the date of grinding. The flour was packed in tight, compacted layers that had to be broken apart with a scoop when the baker needed it, and the barrels were stored on wooden pallets raised slightly off the earthen floor to keep them dry and to discourage the rats that were the constant, unseen enemies of every storehouse. Sacks of dried peas hung from the rafters in coarse, woven bags that were tied at the neck with twine. Their contents a hard, green-yellow pile of split legumes that would be soaked overnight and boiled into a thick, nourishing porridge that the men called peas pudding. Beside the peas hung strings of dried onions and bundles of dried herbs, their leaves brittle and fragrant, and on the floor beneath them stood small kegs of vinegar and barrels of molasses and crocks of preserved butter sealed with a thick layer of salt. The quartermaster's tools were arranged on the far wall, hanging from pegs and nails in neat, ordered rows. Hammers of various sizes hung by their handles, the iron heads dark with a protective coating of grease, the handles smooth and worn from years of gripping. Saws with their teeth wrapped in strips of oiled cloth to prevent rusting, the blades long and flexible, the wooden handles shaped to fit a man's hand. Axes and hatchets, their cutting edges covered with leather sheaths, the handles of straight-grained hickory that had been brought over from the mainland on a supply ship. Coils of rope made from hemp and manila, some as thick as a man's wrist and others thin enough to be used for lashings and repairs, hung from the rafters in heavy spiraling loops that swayed slightly when the building settled. Barrels of iron nails in every size, from the great 8-inch spikes used for the palisade to the tiny 1-inch brads used for furniture and trim, stood open-mouthed near the door, their contents a dull, metallic glitter in the light of a lantern that was not currently burning. The quartermaster, a man named Beecham, who'd been a clerk in a counting house before he enlisted, kept a slate on which he recorded every item that was issued and every item that was received, and the slate hung from a nail beside the door, its surface covered with columns of tiny, chalked numbers that added up to the exact count of everything the fort possessed. On the eastern side of the parade ground, set apart from all the other buildings by a cleared space of at least 50 feet, stood the powder magazine, a low, squat structure built of brick that had been fired in the fort's own kiln, the only brick building within the palisade. The bricks were a deep, reddish-brown color, slightly irregular in shape and size, and they had been laid in a strong English bond pattern with courses of headers and stretchers alternating. The mortar a pale sandy grey that had been mixed with lime and hair to give it strength. The magazine had no windows at all, only a single copper-sheathed door that faced the parade ground, the copper glowing a faint greenish-brown in the moonlight, its surface marked by a network of fine dark lines where the metal had oxidized over the years. The copper was there because copper did not strike sparks, a precaution against the accidental ignition of the barrels of black powder stored within, and the door was fitted with a heavy lock that required 2 separate keys, one held by the commandant and the other by the senior lieutenant, so that neither man could open the magazine alone. A lightning rod, a thin iron bar that rose from the roof and was sunk deep into the earth, stood at the rear corner of the magazine, its purpose to carry the electrical fire of a lightning strike safely into the ground rather than into the powder, and it was inspected monthly by the fort's carpenter and the master gunner, who together filled out a report that was filed in the orderly room. The roof of the magazine was not shingled, but was covered with a thick layer of sod, the grass and weeds growing on it now dormant and brown, their roots binding the soil into a dense living mat that provided insulation against the heat of the summer sun and the cold of the winter winds. The sod had been cut from the riverbank in long rectangular strips and laid over a waterproof membrane of oiled canvas, and it had taken root and spread until it formed a continuous green carpet that blended the magazine into the surrounding earth, making it less conspicuous from a distance, though its purpose was not concealment so much as temperature control. Inside the magazine, which you had seen only a few times during the annual inspection, the barrels of powder were stacked in rows on wooden racks that kept them off the floor, each barrel wrapped in a coarse brown paper that was marked with the date of manufacture and the weight of the contents. The air inside was cool and dry, and smelled of sulphur and charcoal and saltpeter, the 3 ingredients of black powder, and the floor was covered with a thick layer of felt that was kept damp to prevent any spark from surviving. A simple, effective measure that had been used in powder magazines for centuries. Between the magazine and the officers' quarters, a small rectangular garden had been laid out, a kitchen garden for the officers' mess that was tended by a soldier who had been a farmer before he took the king's shilling. The garden was divided into 4 equal squares by narrow paths of packed earth, each square surrounded by a low border of stones that had been gathered from the riverbed, smooth and round, and a pale speckled grey. In one square, the winter cabbage still stood, their outer leaves dark and leathery, their hearts tight and pale, and in another, the dried stalks of the summer beans clung to their poles, brown and brittle and rattling softly when the air moved. A third square held a bed of herbs, rosemary and thyme and sage, their woody stems and small fragrant leaves, grey-green in the moonlight, and the 4th square was empty and turned over, the soil dark and crumbly and ready for the spring planting that would come when the weather warmed. The garden was a small domestic touch in the middle of a military outpost, and it spoke of meals and flavors and the quiet, patient work of growing things, a reminder that the fort was not only a place of defense, but also a place where men lived and ate and tried, in their small ways, to create something like home. Next to the garden, the surgeon's hut stood with its whitewashed stones and its door painted a calm, sober grey, a small, square building with a single window that faced the parade ground. The window was shuttered now, but you had seen inside often enough to picture it clearly. The surgeon's table. A heavy oak bench with a raised lip around its edge and a drain hole at one corner, scrubbed clean and pale. The shelves of bottles and jars, each one labelled with the name of a medicine or a compound, laudanum and calomel and Jesuit's bark and oil, and Fistrelli's glinting, in the light of the surgeon's own lantern. The mortar, a heavy grey stone, bensteld, the first fresh and gradual. The surgeon himself, a quiet, methodical man who had studied at a hospital in London, slept in a small room at the back of the hut, and his assistant, a young corporal who had shown an aptitude for the work, slept on a cot in the main room, within easy reach of the supplies. The hut smelled of vinegar and alcohol and dried herbs, a clean, sharp scent that was different from the other smells of the fort, and it was kept spotlessly clean by the surgeon's strict orders. The floor swept and the linens boiled and the instruments polished to a bright silvery shine. You let your gaze travel slowly from building to building, taking in the closed doors and the dark windows and the silent, waiting quality of each structure. And then you began a quiet mental inventory, a recitation of the fort's contents that you had learned during your first months on the post, when the sergeant had made every new man memorize the supply lists so that they could assist the quartermaster during an emergency. The inventory was a long, soothing catalogue, a list of ordinary, useful things that existed to keep the fort running, and you recited it to yourself in a low, internal murmur, the items appearing in your mind one after another with a gentle, rhythmic regularity. Spades and shovels and picks for the fatigue parties, their handles of ash, their blades of iron kept sharp and free of rust. Buckets of wooden staves and buckets of leather, some for water and some for sand and some for carrying coal. Brooms of birch twigs bound with wire, their bristles stiff and dark. Iron pots and copper kettles for the cookhouse, their bottoms blackened with soot, their interiors scrubbed to a dull gleam. Wooden trenchers and pewter spoons and horn cups for the men, each man responsible for his own, each one marked with a carved initial or a small identifying notch. Blankets of grey wool, thick and scratchy, stored in the barracks chests, smelling of lanolin and wood smoke. Cartridge papers cut to size and stacked in bundles of 100, their edges crisp and sharp. Flannel patches for cleaning the muskets. Small squares of soft red cloth that turned black with powder residue after a single use. Musket balls cast in the sand moulds behind the smithy, their surfaces smooth and round, a faint grey sheen on each one. Gunflints napped from dark English flint, stored in small leather pouches that kept them dry, each one sharp and true. The list went on, a long, peaceful enumeration of the ordinary materials of garrison life, and as you recited it, you felt the same quiet satisfaction that you felt when you looked at the orderly arrangement of the buildings, the sense that everything was in its place, that nothing was missing, that the fort was complete and ready and at rest. The deep, still hours between 3 and 4 in the morning arrived without announcement, bringing with them a change so subtle that it registered not as an event, but as a gradual, cumulative shift in the texture of the air, the weight of the silence, and the temperature of every surface the night touched. You became aware of the change first through the skin of your face, a slight tightening of the pores, a coolness that was a degree or two below the steady ambient chill you had grown accustomed to, and you noticed that when you exhaled through your nostrils, the breath now emerged as a faint white ghost that lingered for a brief moment before dissipating. The air itself felt heavier, as if it had absorbed moisture from the river and the forest, and was now holding that moisture in a fine invisible suspension that pressed gently against your cheeks and forehead. The cold was not a harsh, biting cold, but a soft, creeping coolness that seeped through the layers of wool and linen, finding the small gaps at your collar and your cuffs, and you pulled your coat a little tighter around your shoulders without thinking, a small automatic gesture that belonged to the deep night. The first sign of the change that you could see rather than feel appeared on the iron barrel of your musket, where a fine silvery bloom of dew had begun to form. It started as a faint cloudy haze on the dark blued metal, a dulling of the surface that looked almost like breath on a mirror, and then, as you watched, the haze resolved into individual droplets, Tiny spheres of water, no larger than grains of sand, each one catching the lantern light and throwing it back as a minute. Trembling point of silver. The droplets were scattered at first, isolated and random, but as the minutes passed, they multiplied and drew closer together, their edges touching and merging, until the entire upper surface of the barrel was covered with a continuous glistening film of moisture that ran in thin, irregular channels down the curve of the metal toward the stock. You watched one particular droplet form near the front sight, a small, round bead that grew slowly as it absorbed the microscopic water particles from the air around it, swelling until its own weight overcame its adhesion to the metal, at which point it began to slide downward in a slow, wobbling descent that left a thin, wet trail behind it, a trail that immediately began to fill with new, smaller droplets. The droplet reached the lower edge of the barrel and hung there for a moment, trembling with the accumulated mass of its own surface tension, and then it fell onto the wooden deck with a tiny silent impact that you felt rather than heard, a small cold spot on the back of your hand where it landed. The wool of your coat began to feel damp on its outer surface, the fibers of the broadcloth absorbing the moisture from the air and darkening by a shade or two, the deep brick red of the fabric turning a richer, darker burgundy where the dampness had penetrated. When you touched the sleeve with your bare fingers, the wool felt cool and slightly clammy, not wet enough to be uncomfortable, but wet enough to change the texture of the cloth, making it heavier and denser, and you could smell the faint, clean odor of wet wool, a scent that was like the smell of sheep on a misty hillside, ancient and comforting and entirely familiar. The crossbelt, which was made of thick, white leather, had also absorbed some of the atmospheric moisture, and the pipe clay that whitened it had softened slightly, becoming a little tacky to the touch, the surface losing its dry, powdery smoothness and taking on a faint, dewy sheen. The brass buckle and the brass plate on the crossbelt were beaded with condensation too, the metal now cool and slick under your fingers, and when you touched the brass, it left a faint, metallic smell on your skin, a smell that was like old coins. The dew was not confined to your musket and your clothing, but had settled on every exposed surface of the bastion, transforming the familiar, dry wood of the platform and the palisade into something glistening and slightly altered. The planks of the deck, which had been a pale, weathered grey, now gleamed with a dark, wet sheen that made the grain of the wood stand out in sharp black lines, the annual rings and the medullary rays visible as intricate flowing patterns that had been invisible when the wood was dry. The tops of the palisade logs, those sharpened points that you had run your hand along earlier in the night, were now tipped with a dark, wet stain that spread downward for several inches, each point looking as if it had been dipped in water. And the rough, splintered surfaces of the logs were studded with tiny, glinting droplets that clung to every raised fiber and every projecting splinter. The iron nails and the iron brackets that held the palisade together were coated with a uniform silvery film, the rust on their surfaces now dark and vivid, an orange-brown bloom that seemed to glow against the wet, black iron. The heavy wooden bucket of sand near the sentry box had absorbed moisture along its upper rim, the oak staves swelling slightly so that the iron hoops creaked as they adjusted to the new dimensions of the wood, a low, soft sound that was almost inaudible. The sand itself, which had been dry and loose, now looked darker and denser, the surface grains clumping together where the moisture had reached them, and the wooden scoop that rested on top was damp and beginning to darken along its handle. The fringe of the flag, which had been hanging utterly lifeless against the pole for hours, stirred once. The movement was so small and so brief that you almost did not see it, a single lazy undulation that lifted the heavy woolen bunting by no more than an inch, and then let it fall back against the pole, the fabric settling with a soft, brushing sigh. A long pause followed, a stillness so complete that the air seemed to hold its breath, and then the fringe stirred again. A second time, this time a little higher and a little longer, the dark cloth billowing outward in a slow, gentle curve before it subsided. The third stirring came after another pause, and this time the entire flag, not just the fringe, moved slightly, the furled bundle at the top of the pole shifting against the halyard with a faint, rustling sound that was like the sound of a distant bird adjusting its wings. The movement was not wind in the ordinary sense, but a slow tidal drift of air, a current so weak and so diffuse that it could barely be felt on the skin. And it came from the east, from the direction of the river and the invisible sea beyond the hills, carrying with it the cool, damp breath of the water and the first faint intimation of the distant dawn. The scent of the forest began to change, shifting from the dry, resinous aroma of pine needles and sun-warmed bark to something greener and wetter, a smell that was like crushed leaves and damp earth and the dark, rich humus of the forest floor. The change was subtle but distinct, the sharp, clean smell of pine resin giving way to the rounder, deeper smell of wet moss and rotting wood, and the faint, mushroomy scent of fungi growing on fallen logs, and you could detect beneath it all the cool, mineral smell of the river, which seemed to be rising from the valley with the thickening mist. The air, which had been neutral and almost scentless at the start of your watch, was now filled with a complex, layered fragrance that spoke of water and growth and the slow, patient work of decay. A scent that was as soothing as it was, ancient, the smell of the earth breathing out its moisture into the cool, dark hours before the dawn. The river mist, which had been a flat, white layer filling the valley floor, began to rise. The movement was so slow and so gradual that it seemed less a movement than a change in dimension, the top surface of the mist lifting by inches rather than feet, its texture becoming more dense and more opaque as it absorbed additional moisture from the river below. You watched a low, white tendril detach itself from the main body of the mist and drift upward, a curling, ghostly shape that rose perhaps 10 feet into the air before it dissolved and vanished, its substance dispersing into the darker air above. Another tendril followed, and then another, and soon the entire surface of the mist was in slow, gentle motion, a vast, silent flood of white vapor that crept up the banks of the river and spilled over the lower slopes, filling every hollow and every depression with its soft, luminous presence. The mist moved with the same imperturbable pace that governed everything in the deep night, a pace that was too slow to be perceived in the moment, but whose cumulative effect became visible when you looked away for a while and then looked back, finding that the edge of the mist had advanced by a measurable distance, swallowing a bush here and a fallen log there and a section of the cleared slope that had been visible before. As the mist rose and thickened, the outlines of the trees on the far bank began to soften and blur, their sharp black silhouettes becoming indistinct, their individual trunks merging into a single dark mass that seemed to float on the surface of the white vapor. The branches that had been visible against the sky were now veiled, their fine, terminal twigs disappearing first, then the larger limbs, then the main trunks, until the forest was no longer a collection of separate trees, but a continuous dark band that hovered above the mist like a low, flat cloud. The effect was dreamlike, a softening of the visible world that made the landscape seem less solid and more like a painting rendered in shades of grey and silver, its edges blurred and its details obscured, a landscape that belonged more to the realm of sleep than to the waking world. The sound of the river changed along with the mist, its voice becoming muffled and distant, as if the water were flowing not over stones and gravel, but through a thick layer of felt. The individual notes of the current, the small, liquid gurgles and the faint, splashing ripples, were absorbed by the mist and blended into a single, low, continuous hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that was less a sound than a presence, a soft, ambient drone that filled the valley and the fort and the air around you. The fallen log near the water gate, which had been a source of a steady, bubbling trickle all night, was now completely invisible and nearly inaudible, its voice reduced to a faint, distant murmur that you had to strain to hear. Even the larger sounds of the river, the occasional deeper surge where the current ran faster over a hidden ledge, were flattened and diffused, their sharp edges worn smooth by the layers of mist that wrapped around them. Within the fort, the sounds had grown quieter still, the already subdued noises of the sleeping garrison fading into a near-total silence that was as deep as the silence of the forest. The breathing of the men in the barracks was still there, a slow, rhythmic rise and fall, but it seemed more distant now, as if the damp air were absorbing the sound and carrying it away into the sky. The flagpole creaked once, and then was still, its rope motionless, its pulleys silent. The chickens in the coop behind the bakehouse had fallen into the deepest phase of their sleep, the small clucking murmurs and the rustling of feathers now completely absent, the birds as still and silent as stones. The officer's candle had been extinguished, the watch log had been written up to the hour, and the men in the guardhouse had ceased their low conversations, sitting in a quiet, patient circle around the glowing brazier, their faces blank and peaceful in the red light of the coals. Even the clock in the commandant's house seemed to tick more softly, its pendulum swinging through the damp, cool air with a muffled, rhythmic beat that was felt as much as heard. You stood at your post and let the gradual, gentle transformation of the world wash over you, watching the dew gather and run, feeling the dampness seep into your coat, breathing in the cool, wet scent of the forest, and listening to the softening, muffling voice of the river. The lantern burned on, its flame a tall, steady teardrop of yellow and blue, and the circle of light it cast had taken on a new quality in the damp air, the edges of the circle soft and slightly hazy, the light itself seeming to bloom outward in a faint, golden corona that blurred the boundary between illumination and darkness. The slow, silent advance of the mist and the gradual accretion of dew on every surface were the only events of the hour, a quiet, continuous process that was moving the fort and the forest and the river valley toward the distant, still invisible dawn, one drop of water and one breath of cool air at a time. You were a part of that process now, a still, patient figure on a wooden bastion, your coat growing heavier with moisture, your musket beaded with silver, your breath a small white ghost that appeared and vanished and appeared again, keeping time with the slow, steady rhythm of the night's long, gentle exhale. The long, slow hours of the night watch had a way of loosening the mind from its usual moorings, allowing thoughts to drift away from the immediate surroundings and wander back through the ordinary routines of daylight, not with any urgency or sharpness of recall, but with a gentle, dreamlike quality that was closer to dreaming than to active memory. As you stood on the bastion with the damp wool of your coat heavy on your shoulders and the soft, muffled sounds of the mist-filled valley rising around you, your mind began to move in slow, circular patterns through the familiar tasks and simple rhythms that would fill the hours once your watch was over and the sun had climbed above the eastern hills. There was no effort in this wandering, no attempt to organize or sequence the memories, only a calm, passive reception of images that arose and faded and arose again, each one a small, quiet scene from the ordinary life of the garrison. You saw the parade ground as it would appear at noon, the sun high and bright in a pale washed sky, the packed earth already warming underfoot, the shadows of the buildings sharp and short against the ground. The company would be forming up for inspection, the men emerging from the barracks in small groups, their wool tunics brushed and their cross belts pipe-clayed to a brilliant chalky white, their brass buckles and buttons polished to a dull gleam that caught the sunlight and threw it back in tiny golden sparks. The sergeant would be standing at the center of the parade ground with the muster roll in his hand, a long sheet of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were soft as cloth, the names of every man in the company written out in his own careful, angular script. You could picture the way the sergeant would call the names one by one, his voice slow and methodical, a low rhythmic drone that rose and fell with each syllable, the men answering in turn with a quiet "here" or a simple "present" that carried no more emotion than a stone dropped into still water. The names would come in alphabetical order as they always did, a long, soothing litany of ordinary English and Scottish and Irish surnames, each one a small, familiar sound that belonged to a face and a bunk and a place in the ranks, and the sergeant's finger would move down the page with each response, leaving a tiny, invisible trail of oil from his skin on the paper. After the muster roll came the inspection of arms, a slow, methodical process in which each man would hold out his musket for the sergeant's examination while the captain walked behind the ranks with his hands clasped behind his back, observing everything and saying nothing. The sergeant would take each musket in turn, feeling the flint with his thumb, peering into the pan to check the priming, running a finger along the barrel to test for rust, and then he would hand the weapon back with a small, wordless nod or a quiet instruction to clean the lock or replace the flint before the next guard mount. The sound of the inspection was a series of soft, metallic clicks as pans were opened and closed, the rustle of wool sleeves brushing against wooden stocks, the low, murmured comments of the sergeant, and the occasional soft chuckle from a man who had been caught with a speck of dust in his barrel and knew he would be spending an extra hour with the cleaning rag and the oil bottle. The whole process moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a pace that had been established by long habit and was never hurried, each man receiving his moment of attention and then stepping back into stillness while the next man stepped forward, a gentle, undulating wave of motion that passed down the ranks from right to left. The smell of the bakehouse drifted through your memory, a complex, layered scent that began with the sour, yeasty tang of the rising dough, a smell that was almost like beer or like the faint, fermented odor of a brewery. The dough would be sitting in great, wooden troughs near the clay oven, covered with damp cloths to keep the surface from drying out, and it would be rising slowly, the yeast working its invisible transformation, turning the dense grey mass of flour and water and salt into something alive and breathing, its surface domed and pocked with tiny, bursting bubbles. The baker, a patient, flour-dusted man who had been a miller's apprentice before the army, would be moving around the bakehouse with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of long practice, checking the temperature of the oven by the color of the bricks, testing the dough by pressing it with a floury finger and watching the indentations spring slowly back, turning the loaves on their wooden peels with a deft, practiced flick of the wrist. And then, when the oven was ready and the loaves had been shaped and scored and slid inside on the long-handled peels, the smell would change from sour to something rich and warm and profoundly comforting, the hot, clean scent of baking bread that filled the parade ground and drifted into the barracks and made every man in the fort lift his head and inhale with a quiet, involuntary pleasure. The loaves would emerge from the oven with a dark, golden-brown crust that crackled softly as they cooled, and the baker would set them on wooden racks to rest, their interiors soft and white and steaming, and the men would receive their ration in thick, warm slices that needed nothing but a little salt to be a meal. The afternoon fatigue duty would follow the midday meal, a time when the men were divided into work parties and sent to the various tasks that kept the fort in good order, and you thought of the particular repetitive nature of that work, the way it occupied the hands and left the mind free to wander. Mending the stockade was a task that involved long hours of quiet, focused labor, the men moving along the line of the palisade with hammers and nails and buckets of clay, finding the gaps in the chinking and packing them tight with fresh mortar, replacing the splintered or rotted logs with new ones that had been shaped and sharpened by the carpenters, their surfaces still pale and fragrant with the scent of fresh sap. The work was slow and methodical, each repair a small, complete act that had a beginning and a middle and an end, and the sound of it was a gentle, percussive rhythm of hammer blows and the soft, wet slap of clay being smoothed into place. The voices of the men quiet and occasional, a comment about the weather or the condition of the wood, nothing that required an answer. Cleaning the cannon was another fatigue task, one that involved long, rhythmic scrubs with a wire brush along the length of the brass barrel, the bristles making a soft, scratching sound as they removed the residue of the last firing, the men working in pairs with a bucket of oil and a pile of rags, the metal growing warm and bright under their hands. The brush moved back and forth, a steady pendular motion that was as regular as a metronome, and the smell of the oil and the warm brass and the faint, acrid tang of old powder residue blended into a single industrial fragrance that was as familiar as the smell of the barracks. Polishing the brass was a task that could absorb an entire afternoon without difficulty, a quiet, meditative activity that required nothing more than a soft rag, a tin of polish, and a patient circular motion of the hand. Every piece of brass on the soldier's uniform and equipment, the buttons on the coat, the plate on the crossbelt, the buckle on the waistbelt, the trigger guard, and the side plate of the musket, all of it needed to be kept bright and free of tarnish, and the men would sit on their bunks or on the benches outside the barracks with their rags and their tins, working the polish into the metal with small circular rubs, the cloth turning black as it lifted the oxidation from the surface. The smell of the brass polish was sharp and ammoniac, a clean chemical scent that bit at the nostrils, and the sound of the polishing was a soft, rhythmic shushing, the cloth moving in circles, pausing while the man inspected the shine, then resuming with the same patient, repetitive motion. As the tarnish came away, the brass would emerge in a warm golden glow, the surface so smooth and reflective that a man could see his own face in it, distorted and curved and strangely calm, and the satisfaction of that transformation, the change from dull brown to bright gold, was a small quiet pleasure that never grew old. The darning of socks was a task that belonged to the evening hours, when the men sat on their bunks in the barracks with the lanterns lit and the fire in the stove crackling softly, their boots off and their feet wrapped in blankets, the day's work done. The socks were thick grey wool, knitted by women in the settlement and sent to the fort in bundles, and they wore through at the heels and the toes with a regularity that made darning a constant, necessary chore. The men would use a wooden darning egg, a smooth, egg-shaped tool that was pushed inside the sock to hold the fabric taut, and a needle threaded with a length of matching grey wool, and they would work the needle in and out, weaving a new patch of fabric across the worn area, the stitches small and even and close together. The sound of the darning was a soft, regular ticking, the needle passing through the wool with a tiny, whispering sigh, and the men would sit in silence or talk quietly among themselves, their voices low and their hands moving with a steady, automatic rhythm that required no thought. The satisfaction of the task lay in the slow, visible repair, the way the hole shrank and closed and disappeared under the lattice of new wool, the sock becoming whole again and ready for another week of marches and parades and long cold hours on the bastion. The whitening of the crossbelt with pipe clay was a task that occupied the early morning hours before the inspection, when the men would take their belts to the washhouse or to the benches outside the barracks and work the clay into the leather with a stiff brush and a little water, the mixture forming a thin, white slurry that soaked into the pores of the material and dried to a hard, brilliant finish. The pipe clay came in blocks, a fine white powder that had been pressed into dense, chalky bricks and wrapped in paper, and it smelled of earth and minerals, a cool, clean scent that was like the smell of a riverbed. The men would scrape a little of the clay into a tin of water and mix it into a smooth, thin paste, then apply it to the belt with a small, flat brush, working the liquid into every crease and seam, the brush making a soft, scrubbing sound against the leather, a sound that was like the swish of a broom on a wooden floor. As the clay dried, it would turn from grey to white, the belt growing stiff and bright, and the men would buff it with a clean, dry cloth until it gleamed, the white surface so pure and clean that it seemed to glow in the morning light. The process was slow and repetitive, each belt receiving the same sequence of steps, the scrape and the mix and the brush and the buff, and the result was a uniform parade ground perfection that would last exactly until the first rainstorm or the first hour of sweat and movement, at which point the clay would crack and flake and the whole process would need to be done again, a cycle that repeated itself with the same quiet, inevitable regularity as the turning of the stars. The blacking of the boots was an equally methodical task, the men using a small tin of blacking, a mixture of lampblack and tallow and beeswax that had been cooked together into a thick, dark paste that smelled of smoke and grease, and a stiff, short bristle brush that worked the blacking into the pores of the leather in small circular scrubs. The boots would be dampened first with a little water, just enough to open the grain of the leather, and then the blacking would be applied in thin, even coats, each one rubbed in until the leather was warm and the blacking had vanished into the surface, leaving behind a dark, glossy sheen that deepened with each successive layer. The men would sit with one boot on their knee and the brush in their hand, their heads bent over their work, the brush moving in the same slow, circular pattern, around and around, the motion as steady and as calming as the swing of the clock pendulum in the commandant's house. After the blacking came the polishing with a soft lamb's wool cloth, a rapid back-and-forth buffing that brought the shine to a high, mirror-like gloss, and the men would hold the boot up to the lantern light and turn it this way and that, looking for any dull spots or streaks, a small, careful inspection that was its own quiet reward. The memories move through your mind in a slow, circular current, each one flowing into the next without any clear boundary, the way one cloud merges into another in a grey, overcast sky. The snap of the wool tunic being brushed, a sharp, percussive sound that was followed by a soft, whisking rustle as the brush moved down the sleeve. The smell of the leather in the harness room, a rich, earthy scent that was like the smell of a saddle shop, the leather oiled and supple and dark. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer in the forge, a steady, ringing clang that carried across the parade ground and echoed off the palisade, a sound that was as much a part of the fort's daily rhythm as the reveille and the retreat. The sight of the surgeon's garden in the afternoon sun, the herbs green and fragrant, the bees moving from flower to flower with a low, drowsy hum, the taste of the small beer that was served with the midday meal, a weak, slightly sour brew that was more water than beer, cool and refreshing and faintly fizzy on the tongue. The feeling of the sun on your face as you stood at ease during a lull in the drill, the warmth soaking into your skin and loosening the muscles of your neck and shoulders, a brief, wordless moment of contentment in the middle of the long, ordinary day. These were the small, quiet rhythms that made up the life of the garrison, and they repeated themselves with a comforting, unvarying regularity, each day like the day before, each task like the task before, a long, slow cycle of work and rest, and work again that was as steady and as predictable as the tides. There was a deep, quiet satisfaction in the completion of each task, the knowledge that the brass was bright and the belt was white and the sock was whole and the cannon was clean, a satisfaction that asked for no praise and expected no reward, a satisfaction that was entirely its own. The life of the fort was a life of small, complete actions, each one contributing to the larger order of the garrison, and the men who lived that life found in its repetition not monotony, but a kind of peace, a sense that everything was as it should be, and that their labor, however small, was a part of something that would endure. A sound reached you through the cool, damp air, a sound that was not a memory but a real present vibration that rolled across the water from the settlement outside the fort, and you lifted your head slightly to listen. It was the church bell, a single, low tone that resonated through the mist and the darkness, the sound deep and round and slow, a note that seemed to rise from the earth itself and spread outward in concentric, invisible rings. The bell chimed the hour, though you did not count the strokes, letting the sound wash over you without needing to interpret it, a calm, sonorous voice that spoke of order and ritual, and the steady, measured passage of time. The note hung in the air for a long, slow moment, fading by imperceptible degrees, its edges softening and blurring as it dissolved into the mist, and then it was gone, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper and more complete than before. You returned your attention to the lantern and the palisade and the slow, drifting mist, and you let the memories of the ordinary day settle back into the quiet, passive place from which they had come, ready to be taken up again when the watch was over and the sun was high and the simple, repetitive work of the garrison began once more. The darkness that had held the fort and the forest in its deep, seamless embrace for so many hours began at last to yield, not with a sudden breaking, but with a slow, almost imperceptible differentiation, a gradual separation of the world into shades of deep grey, where before there had been only a uniform black. The change began in the east, behind the dark ridge of the hills and the solid, obscuring mass of the forest canopy, where the sky lightened by a degree so small that you could not be certain you were seeing it, a faint charcoal tinge that was less a colour than an absence of the deepest darkness. You noticed it first as a slight softening of the horizon line, the jagged silhouette of the treetops becoming more distinct, their edges sharper and more clearly defined against the sky, as if the black ink of the night were thinning and beginning to let a little of the underlying paper show through. The star field overhead, which had been brilliant and crowded with points of cold white light, began to pale one constellation at a time, starting with the smallest and most distant stars, those faint, peripheral glimmers that had hovered at the edge of visibility, and as they faded, the larger, brighter stars seemed to draw back into themselves, their light hardening from a soft, twinkling glow to a sharper, more concentrated point that burned briefly with renewed intensity before it began to dim. Cassiopeia was still visible, its W shape now tilted farther toward the west, but its stars were no longer the brilliant diamonds they had been at midnight, and the Great Bear had grown pale and ghostly, its familiar outline fading into the pale grey wash that was spreading upward from the horizon. The North Star, that constant fixed point above the flagpole, remained visible the longest. A solitary, steady spark in a sky that was slowly emptying of its lesser lights, and then it too began to waver and grow dim as the approaching dawn claimed the heavens for its own. The mist in the river valley, which had been a flat, white blanket through the deep hours of the night, began to take on a new quality as the first faint light of the coming day touched its upper surface. The dense, opaque white softened and became translucent, a pearlescent glow that seemed to rise from within the mist itself, a pale, silvery luminescence that had no single source but was simply there, a diffused, gentle radiance that filled the valley and spilled over the lower slopes of the hills. The mist was no longer a solid, featureless mass, but a living, moving thing, its surface rippling with slow, silent currents, its edges curling and folding like the surface of a quiet sea. And as the light increased by tiny, measured increments, the mist began to thin in places, revealing the dark, blurred shapes of the tallest trees on the far bank, their trunks still indistinct, their branches still veiled, but their presence now a fact rather than a guess. The river itself remained hidden, but you could sense it now, a dark, moving presence beneath the mist, its voice a low, continuous murmur that was no longer muffled, but was beginning to clarify, the individual notes of the current separating themselves from the general hum. Small, liquid sounds of water moving over stone and around the roots of trees. A single bird, a robin, made a tentative note from the woods to the north, a brief, questioning phrase of 3 notes that rose and fell and then stopped, leaving a silence that was deeper and more expectant than before. The note was the first deliberate sound of the waking day, the first voice to break the long, continuous hush of the night, and it hung in the cool, damp air for a moment before fading, a small, brave announcement that the darkness was passing and the world was preparing to resume its daily round. The robin called again, this time with more confidence, the 3 notes repeated with a little more volume and a little more certainty, and from somewhere deeper in the forest a second robin answered, its voice fainter and more distant, a soft echoing reply that was almost like a question itself, and the 2 birds exchanged a few more notes before falling silent, their brief conversation complete. The silence that followed was not the deep, absolute silence of the night, but a poised, expectant stillness, a silence that was waiting to be filled by the other, larger sounds of the approaching dawn. Behind you, within the walls of the fort, the first stirrings of the waking garrison began to make themselves heard. Small, soft sounds that were as gentle and as unhurried as the robin's call. A door creaked open somewhere in the barracks, the sound of iron hinges turning in their sockets. A low, rusty groan that was followed by the soft, scuffing tread of bare feet on a wooden floor. A man rising early to use the latrine or to stoke the stove in the mess hall. The sound was brief and soon faded, but it was a signal, a small, unmistakable sign that the long, collective sleep of the fort was coming to an end. A few minutes later, another door opened, this one the heavy, wooden door of the smithy, and you heard the soft, clanking sound of the blacksmith's apprentice raking out the cold ashes of the forge, an iron rake scraping across the stone hearth in long, slow strokes, the ashes falling into a metal bucket with a dry, rustling hiss. The apprentice was a young man still in his teens, and he performed this task every morning before the smith arrived, clearing away the grey, powdery residue of the previous day's fire and laying a new bed of kindling and charcoal, preparing the forge for the day's work of shoeing horses and mending tools and straightening bent nails. The sound of the rake was a steady, rhythmic scraping, a sound that belonged to the earliest edge of the day, and it was followed by the faint metallic clink of the bucket being lifted and carried outside to be emptied on the ash heap behind the smithy. The duty drummer stepped out of the guardhouse, yawning, to make ready for reveille. You could see him from your post on the bastion, a small, slight figure in his red coat and his round brimless cap, the drum hanging from a strap across his shoulder, the brass shell catching the first faint light of the dawn and glowing with a dull golden sheen. He stood in the doorway of the guardhouse for a moment, stretching his arms above his head and rolling his shoulders, working out the stiffness of a night spent on a wooden bench near the brazier, and then he walked out onto the parade ground, his boots making soft, crunching sounds on the packed earth, and took up his position near the flagpole. He did not begin to play yet, for reveille was still some minutes away, but he checked the tension of the drumhead by pressing it with his thumb and adjusted the strap on his shoulder, small preparatory actions that were part of his own quiet ritual, a ritual he had performed every morning since he had been appointed duty drummer 6 months before. You performed your final slow patrol of the parapet, walking the same narrow, elevated path of wooden planks that you had walked so many times during the night, your left hand trailing along the tops of the palisade logs, your boots falling into the same shallow, worn groove that the boots of countless other sentries had made. The walkway was wet with dew, the planks dark and slick underfoot, and you placed each step with a little more care than you had before, feeling the slight slippery give of the wet wood, the way the grain had risen slightly in the dampness, creating a fine textured surface that your boots gripped with a soft, adhesive sound. The dew had darkened the wood to the color of strong tea, a rich, deep brown that was almost black in the shadows, and the droplets that clung to the palisade logs and the iron brackets in the wooden rail were now clearly visible in the growing light, each one a tiny, perfect sphere of silver that trembled and caught the dawn and threw it back in 1,000 miniature reflections. You passed the brass 6-pounder cannon under its tarpaulin, the dark humped shape now clearly visible, the tarpaulin itself beaded with moisture, the ropes that tied it down dark and heavy with dew, and you paused to check the champion one last time and to run a hand over the wet, cold barrel, the metal slick and smooth under your palm. All was secure. You turned at the far corner and walked back toward the bastion with the same slow, measured pace, your shadow, which had been your silent companion through the night, now pale and faint and stretched to an impossible length across the deck, a thin, grey ghost that was fading even as you watched it. Back at the bastion, you checked the flint one last time, opening the pan cover and peering inside at the fine grey powder, still dry despite the damp air, the grains loose and ready, the flint itself sharp and firm in the jaws of the cock. You closed the pan with a soft, precise click and rested the musket against your shoulder, the weight of the weapon now as familiar as the weight of your own arm, and you stood still, facing the east, where the sky was now a pale, translucent grey that was slowly infusing with colour, a faint rosy blush that spread upward from the horizon and tinted the undersides of the few high clouds with a delicate pinkish glow. The robin was singing steadily now, a full, clear song that poured from the edge of the forest in a continuous liquid stream, and other birds had joined it, the soft, piping notes of a thrush, the distant laughing call of a woodpecker, the harsh, chattering scold of a squirrel that had woken to find the cat prowling near its tree. The world was waking, and the sounds of the waking world were a gentle, rising chorus that filled the air and pushed back the last lingering remnants of the night's deep silence. Far off from the direction of the settlement outside the fort, a rooster crowed, a loud, brash, triumphant sound that cut through the softer bird calls and echoed across the water and the mist, a sound that was as old as farming and as ordinary as the sound that was as old as farming and as ordinary as the sunrise itself. The rooster crowed again, a second slightly shorter call that was answered by another rooster, this one closer, perhaps from a homestead on the river road, and the two birds exchanged a few more cries before settling back into their morning routine of scratching and strutting and keeping watch over their hens. The sound was a familiar one, heard every morning from the bastion, and it marked the moment when the night officially gave way to the day, a rough, vigorous voice that announced the return of light and warmth and the ordinary business of living. The flag was hauled up the pole in the dim grey light, the halyard creaking through the pulley, the dark, furled bundle of wool bunting rising slowly into the pale sky, and then, when it reached the top, the signalman tugged a cord and the flag unfurled with a soft, snapping rustle, the red and white and blue of the king's colours spreading out in the still, cool air, the fabric heavy and damp but moving gently now, stirred by a breeze that had not been there, that arrived with the dawn. The flag hung from the pole in graceful, lazy folds, its colours muted in the grey light, and it moved slowly, a gentle swaying motion that was like the breathing of a sleeping animal, a presence that would watch over the fort through the long, ordinary day to come. The corporal of the relief climbed the stairs with another man, a soldier you recognized from your company. A quiet, solid man with a face that was still puffy from sleep, and a coat that was buttoned slightly askew, evidence that he had dressed in a hurry in the dark barracks. The corporal carried his slate in his chopstick, and he gave you a small, wordless nod as he stepped onto the bastion platform, his eyes moving over the musket and the lantern and the deck, taking in the state of the post with a single, practiced glance. You turned to face him, and he spoke the formal words in a low, calm voice, a question that asked whether the post was secure, and you replied in the same low, calm tone that the post and all were secure, that nothing of note had occurred during the watch, that the musket was in good order, and the flint was sharp, and the cartridges were dry and accounted for. The words were formula, a small verbal ritual that was performed at every relief, and they had the quality of a quiet spoken password, a recognition that the duty was being transferred from one man to another with all the proper forms observed. You handed over the lantern, the horn panels still glowing with their warm amber light, the candle within now a stub that had burned down to within an inch of its base, the flame still tall and steady, but surrounded by a small liquid pool of melted beeswax that had collected in the tin base. The corporal took the lantern and hung it back on the iron hook, and then you handed over the musket, feeling the weight of it leave your hands, the walnut stock and the iron barrel passing into the keeping of the other man, who received it with a quiet, practiced ease and rested the butt on the deck in the same slight depression that you had used all night. The transfer was complete. The post was no longer yours. The long, quiet vigil of the night had ended. You walked down the wooden stairs from the bastion, your boots making the same soft, creaking sounds on the worn treads that they had made when you climbed them hours before, and you emerged onto the parade ground just as the first direct rays of the sun broke over the eastern hills, a sudden golden flood of light that turned the mist to silver and set the dewdrops on the grass ablaze with tiny, brilliant points of white fire. The parade ground was no longer dark and empty, but was filling with the quiet, purposeful movement of the waking garrison, men walking to the latrine or the washhouse, the baker hauling a sack of flour from the storehouse, the blacksmith's apprentice carrying an armload of kindling, the duty drummer still standing near the flagpole, his sticks now in his hands, waiting for the sergeant to give the signal for reveille. The air was cool and fresh and smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the clean green scent of the forest after a night of dew, and you filled your lungs with it, a deep, slow breath that tasted of morning and the end of duty and the quiet satisfaction of a watch completed without incident. You walked across the parade ground toward the mess hall, a long, low building next to the cookhouse, and as you walked, the duty drummer finally began to play, the sharp, crisp rattle of the reveille cutting through the morning air, a sound that was quick and rhythmic and full of energy, a sound that was quick and rhythmic and full of energy, a summons to the men to rise and dress and fall in for the muster, a sound that,